Hey there, I am a woman in my 40s. I've had my license as a real estate agent for more than 10 years. People often tell me I'm a great real estate agent. People tell me I'm a good real estate agent. But that doesn't mean I can tell you how much a house will go up or down in value. But based on my experience and careful research, I can tell by looking at the cadastral map what the land is worth now, how it could be developed, and how the land's surroundings could be used to make money. I can then predict whether the land's value will go up or down because of these factors. Making a judgment would be a better way to explain it. In any case, I've used these skills to help my in-laws when they were in trouble. My marriage was great. Everyone in my family was nice, including my husband, my father-in-law, and my other in-laws. They all loved me so much, even though I was their youngest daughter-in-law. Because my father-in-law had been sick for a long time, I was taking care of his assets. My wife's dad owned a lot of land and needed the help of a real estate agent who knew what they were doing. I raised my father-in-law's properties by reinvesting in good places while I was taking care of his lands. I didn't mean to be greedy by taking his land for myself or anything like that, of course. I was lucky enough to live with these nice people as if I were family. One day, I was just enjoying my life when my mother-in-law showed up out of the blue. I thought his mother was dead because that's all I had heard about her since I met my husband. Something very strange happened. Why did her family and my husband say she was dead when she was still alive? It was strange how my husband and his father treated my mother-in-law after seeing her again after many years apart. Even though she was married and had given birth to my husband, they all talked about her like she wasn't there, even though she was a mother and wife. I asked my husband straight out, "Is there something I should know? Because I'm naturally interested." "Why are you curious?" I said, "Of course, I'm interested. Strangely, everyone told me that your mother was dead, but she is still alive and well. She also acts like she just got back from traveling after being gone for decades. Then you and your family are treating her as if she's a non-existent person. So it's so confusing," I told her. He didn't say anything. Yes, that's right. Now that I think about it, you never held a service for her. That means you knew your mother, I said. Even if she died on the street somewhere, we wouldn't have done anything to remember her, he said. Oh my God, do you think that woman is my mom? Isn't she somebody else? Is she not your birth mother or the woman who gave birth to me? I had a question. She gave birth to me, but she's not my mother. We decided she wasn't going to be her mother after she left us and moved in with someone else while my dad was in bed recovering from surgery. The truth is that I'm glad she left us and ran away. I wish she wasn't my mother even before she left, my husband said. I learned that my in-laws, who were always getting along, had a lot of problems in the past after hearing my husband's sad story. They thought my mother-in-law was dead when she was still alive. I'll start with the conclusion. It was because my mother-in-law was a bad wife and mother. When he was younger, my father-in-law was very poor. Now he owns a lot of land and is very rich. He was so hungry that he would be lucky to eat one meal a day. His wife hated how poor they were, so she left her family behind and ran away at night. His mom was never a good person, even before she ran away. My husband's dad worked as a day laborer on building sites and was often gone looking for work in faraway places. Her young children did all the housework while she sat around most of the time. It was worse when my father-in-law wasn't home when my mother-in-law did bad things. The bad weather would make her mad, and when the food arrived cold, she would lose it. Then one day, my father-in-law got so tired at work that he couldn't stand up and walk anymore. He was unable to make a living. Then my husband's mother-in-law left, leaving her sick husband and young children who still needed her care. They were just making up words when they said she was playing at night because she really took anything valuable in the house. She didn't pay attention to her husband or her young children, who were pleading with her for food. As a mother, it wouldn't be easy for her to take all the money and important things, right? All of my in-laws and my father-in-law had lived as if my mother-in-law were dead. Given the circumstances, who could still care about my mother-in-law after she came back after decades? I could 100% understand how they felt. But I have more of a fear and dislike for my mother-in-law because she left her family in the past. My father-in-law was dying after a long illness when my mother-in-law finally came back after being gone for decades. She didn't ask about her husband's health at first, though. She asked for something else. You must be the youngest daughter-in-law. So what I heard was that you're a real estate broker and you have been managing the family properties, right? She sought answers to. How did you understand that? You don't need to know how I knew. How many homes does my husband own? It was my turn. I'm sorry, I can't answer that. All of my father-in-law's businesses are in his own name. Get permission from my father-in-law if you're really interested. Have you heard from my husband? I told her that the one who is married to your father-in-law is me. I heard. I added, why aren't you my mother-in-law? She's not even the mother of my husband and his family. Ha! Since he was a kid, my youngest son has been stupid, so how did he get a wife like you? Hello, my name is Mary, and I'm your mother-in-law. You should be careful because I don't think someone like you could be my mother-in-law. I'm not that simple, she said. Are you being territorial right now? I inquired. You'll find out soon whether it's my being territorial or not, she said. After that, I began to look into my mother-in-law's life. It was clear that she had come back with a different goal in mind, to steal the inheritance. But I still needed to be sure every once in a while. People can turn over a new leaf at the end of their lives after having done many bad things. After a bad event, I had to make sure that my mother-in-law's comeback after decades wasn't a one-of-a-kind case, and that she wasn't trying to get the inheritance like I thought she was. Then I had to figure out how to keep my in-laws safe from her evil greed. Also, who said, perhaps turns inevitably. Like I thought she would be, my mother-in-law was just like that. It wasn't a surprise that my mother-in-law left her family and ran away at night over the past few decades. She had been cheating on other people and stealing from them her whole life. People thought it was cute that she lived off of other people's money and never paid it back, even though she had a criminal record for many frauds, because she was a terrible con artist. Once I knew who my mother-in-law really was, I checked to see if the cops or FBI had put her on a list of people they wanted to catch. She had just gotten out of jail, so she wasn't on the list yet. I felt bad that my mother-in-law wasn't on that list. You might say that's a mean thing to think, but no matter how nice you are, you couldn't say that I was mean after hearing my story. It was too bad that my mother-in-law wasn't on the wanted list, but I didn't have time to make plans to protect my in-laws and me from my greedy mother-in-law, who was after the estate. It was on the day that my father-in-law died that I carefully told everyone what I knew about my mother-in-law. My in-laws and I were more concerned with holding a proper service than with coming up with a way to stop my mother-in-law's greed. But I was worried the whole time my mother-in-law's funeral was going on because she didn't show up. My mother-in-law finally showed up on the day of the funeral. If the cops had a list of people they were looking for, I thought the problem would be fixed right away. She sneaked up on them and looked around, hoping to find a basket full of money bags that people had left to send their condolences to the family. You can't find the gift basket, can you? I asked her with a smile. Next, I was going to look at the envelopes for the guests and sort the cash. Then I would talk about the gift. The basket went away though, didn't it? She asked. What are we going to do, right? I looked down my nose at her. That's you. You're the one giving it to them instead of me, she yelled. Would I have to leave that out without checking? I already knew what kind of person you were. You're so sneaky. How much money do you think that is? I found out how much property my illness has left behind, I replied. Oh, you didn't even go to the funeral because you were eager to learn that, right? So when I see you, maybe things will turn out the way I thought they would. This is what I always do when I see you, I said. Be quiet. I'm not a queer person. In the eyes of the law, I'm the first person in line. Everybody should hand everything over to me, no matter what you and my kids say. That probably won't happen, so you should know that, she warned. Since you are married to my father-in-law, I promise you won't get any family money. I must admit that the warning I gave my mother-in-law was a bit of a trick. Even though my father-in-law was sick because he died so quickly, my in-laws and I were not able to make any plans for how to deal with my mother-in-law's greedy behavior. As expected, she started showing how greedy she was in order to get her husband's big inheritance all to herself. She sent proof to my in-laws right away that her marriage to my father-in-law was still legal. It showed that people knew about what was being sent to the court to get my father-in-law's will certified. Even though she had been tried many times for fraud while committing crimes, she knew a lot about how the court system worked, which helped her. I talked to a few lawyers on behalf of my husband and his family only. Everyone who worked as a lawyer gave the same answers. It is possible to keep your mother-in-law from getting the estate if you want to. That's great. They asked, "What's the way?" You need to go to court. You need to ask the court to officially declare that the marriage between your father-in-law and mother-in-law is over. In this way, you can avoid a trial. It won't be simple, they said. Then, I replied, that's probably why I said it happens. Since your father-in-law died, it will be even harder. They went on, it's probably the same no matter which lawyer you meet, because the courts aren't very friendly when it comes to divorce and inheritance issues. One piece of advice I can give you is that most of the time, pretty good deals are made in this situation. It won't be as stressful as going to court. We don't want an agreement that most people would think is reasonable in this case, they said. Okay, I'll be back when the trial is over. When my husband and his family heard that lawyers thought it would be hard to fight with his mother, they were upset. People should always be able to get in touch with the government. But as a real estate agent who deals with land and property, I found court fights very strange and hard to predict. Additionally, regular people like my husband and in-laws felt like they had no choice but to carry the weight. My husband and his in-laws did not agree to a ridiculous deal, though, because they did not want to recognize their mother's role as their mother. In order to cheer them up, I gave them a small bit of hope. Why should our silly game make us the victims? Since I was the youngest daughter-in-law, I had all the responsibility, so I asked him to trust me and not worry. That's how my husband and his in-laws chose to get ready for court. Of course, I wasn't crazy about my confidence. There was only one thing that was certain. I was sure that my mother-in-law didn't have enough money to go to court over the estate. There would be no reason for my mother-in-law to send proof that she is married or try to steal money from the money basket at my father-in-law's wake if she could afford a lawyer and go to court. And this time, too, my mother-in-law never did anything to change my mind. As if to show that she couldn't afford to hire a lawyer to go to court, she broke into my in-laws' house with some neighborhood bad guys, made a scene, and demanded that the property's title be transferred. The marriage license and driver's license that my mother-in-law waved at us were her weapons. She had no shame at all. She yelled, "Look, aren't you crossed off as your dad's wife? He has never formally split up with me. Yes, is that right? If you know, you should first change how you feel." "You jerk in front of my mom," she screamed. "This is how I think my father-in-law would act if he were still alive. You stole everything valuable from the house and then went away, leaving your sick husband and young children behind. How dare you drool over a house?" I replied, "Don't you think I know you're doing this because you're afraid to lose? You must have been told by the lawyers that I'm the most important person in the court case about the inheritance, right? So you must know something about the law since you've been to and from court. Okay, Mrs. X, convict. Is that not true?" I pushed back. "That was a long time ago. It's possible to mess up." "How many times have you been convicted of a crime, huh?" she asked. I made a mistake. "Who believes that? Did your friends who are in prison tell you that? But you're just that to our family. A liar, a criminal, a former prisoner, and a bad thief who didn't show up for decades," I said. "Hey, lawyers said that. The marriage between you and my father-in-law will have been over a long time ago if you go to court. We won't have to pay you anything if that's proven. It's clear that you have no idea how hard it is to go to court because you talk too much. One thing I know for sure is true. You know how tough fights can get. You also don't have the money to hire a lawyer, which is why you're making a scene here. You want the fortune but don't want to go to court, I said. She stumbled and said, You, that's not us though. Remember that I am enough to carry that weight by myself. Stay away from our family if you don't want to see something worse. I'll be nice and buy you a hamburger, even a combo, if you promise that. Watch out, I said. Let's see if you can be the last person standing and laughing. The things I said to my mother-in-law were planned ahead of time by my in-laws and me as a way to get my mother-in-law to bring those thugs to put even more pressure on us. They did exactly what we asked them to do so we could get real proof. They smashed things in the house and said they would beat all of my in-laws. All of those moves were caught on camera by cell phones that my in-laws kept hidden. To get what we wanted as much proof as possible that my mother-in-law was violent and made threats. But my husband got home in the middle of the chaos. He had left to prepare the case against my mother-in-law at the lawyer's office a few hours before she and those thugs started causing trouble. He held a piece of paper in his hands and had a shocked look on his face. My in-laws were also stunned when they saw the piece of paper. It was clear that they were feeling completely hopeless. The paper was quickly taken away and read with great pleasure by my mother-in-law. My husband found my father-in-law's will after the fact. What was written in the will was shocking. The notice said that my mother-in-law would be inheriting a big plot of land. If things keep going this way, the family will see my mother-in-law as their mother, and they will give my mother-in-law the land and everything else they own. The land that was left to the family in the will was so big that it could fit several soccer and baseball fields. I changed my mind after carefully looking at the land register address and started to look for my mother-in-law. Let me tell you the truth, I said. It was all a lie to talk about the court case. Since you are legally married to my father-in-law, I really didn't think we would win the hearing. You're good at going into great detail about things that are clear. Still, wouldn't having the land and it will be enough to make all your dreams come true. How do you know I'm a licensed real estate agent? It's big enough to hold a lot of soccer and baseball fields, I thought. Then there was a small smile on my mother-in-law's face. Using my energy to help me, I kept convincing her. To be honest, we don't think we can win the court case. However, if things go this way, you will also have to go through a lot of mental pain. Do not worry. Have you ever seen a rich person lose a case? It's something I've never seen before, doesn't it? This case will go all the way to the Supreme Court when it starts. Because of this, you won't be able to get your fortune until the hearing is over. First, I'm going to file an order to stop you from getting it. It will take at least a few years to go through all the requests to get the money. How could you wake up after all those years of worry when that great land was right there in front of you? What do you want to say? We should find a middle ground instead of going to court with each other. You will get the land and finish it instead. Please just write a note of promise. For the land written in the will, you will give up the rest of your inheritance and leave the rest behind. You can choose to take that huge piece of land right now without any trouble, or you can fight with everything you have for years and go to court to get everything written in the will. I want to stress again that the land mentioned in the will is huge, enough to fit many soccer and baseball fields, I said. If I sell that much land, I will have enough money to live on for the rest of my life without having to work. My mother-in-law said, That's a great deal, kid. May I just sign and put my thumbprint here? Without a doubt, it will happen, right? Should we get ready right away with the ink stamp? She asked excitedly. Now you're finally making sense. This is something you should have done a long time ago, I told him. My wife's mother got very excited and signed a promissory note that said she would only inherit the lands listed in the will. She gave up her right to receive the rest of the estate and signed it with her thumbprint. We had it notarized. She had no idea what bad things would happen next. My wife's mother called a few days after she signed a note promising to take only the land listed in the will. When I talked to my mother-in-law on the phone, her voice was weak and whiny. As planned, sweetheart. I just came to check out the land I inherited. there's a problem. How is the land? How is it that there are mountains on all four sides? There aren't any roads or houses nearby, she said. To be polite, I asked, is there anything else? A hiker says this land is a refuge of some kind, she said. So, you're in the mountains now. I had a question. That's correct. She told him, I think I must have come to the wrong place. I think you went to the right place. What if the land is a safe place? A place where nature can be protected. Don't even dream about growth or anything like that. Be careful as you go down. You could hurt a natural habitat, and that would add another crime to your record, I told him. After I said that, I put the phone down. Finally, my husband, my in-laws, and I cheered. How did that take place? Weren't we sucked dry by my mother-in-law the day she broke into my in-laws' house with those thugs? When I looked at my father-in-law's will, I saw that my mother-in-law got a huge piece of land. I was sure that the land was my father-in-law's punishment and a threat to my mother-in-law. It was true that the land was big enough for many baseball and soccer fields. What was important was the type of land it was on. It was in the middle of nowhere, in the mountains, away from any roads or towns. There have been no plans for growth at all. It was an area for protecting nature that could never be built on. That being said, the market price was already very low, and there was no chance that it would go up. I knew that because I had been in charge of my father-in-law's land for a long time. There was no way we didn't know it, but everyone did. I even got my mother-in-law to agree to give up other inheritances at the end of the fake plea. When my mother-in-law got the land that couldn't be quickly sold and turned into cash, she couldn't even pay the estate taxes. She lost all of her money. As planned, she called me one more time because she was so desperate. The caller made threats and asked for money. She asked, "Now, what are you going to do?" I laughed. It was written down that she would give up her right to other inheritances. And I even had video of her breaking into my in-laws' house and threatening and harassing us. I told her in a mocking way that she could do anything to go back to jail. With a sigh, my mother-in-law hung up the phone and didn't answer again that day. Finally, there was peace between my in-laws and me again. In today's language, my father-in-law got even by working with his four sides and his daughter-in-law, who was a real estate salesman. Now I'm raising the value of the assets by taking care of my in-laws' fortune, which was a gift from my father-in-law. Because none of our kids are like my mean mother-in-law, my husband, and I have become great parents. How did she get away? Every year, she gets caught up in the Paladin mess because she hasn't paid her estate and land taxes on time. My in-laws and I had dinner together yesterday. All over again. I thought they were all very nice and kind people. That makes me miss my husband's dad even more. We love each other, and I want to spend the rest of my life living happily ever after. Father, please keep an eye on us. Please cheer for me and leave wise words in the area for comments. It really helps me when you click like and subscribe. Have a great day.
While I was away on a business trip, my husband secretly moved his mistress into our home. When I returned early, I caught them red-handed in our bedroom. They overpowered me, locked me away, and demanded my house and luxury car. But they never saw my next move coming. It ruined them forever. If you had asked me a few years ago, I would have told you that my life was perfect. My name is Ava Parker, and I am 36 years old. I live in Chicago, Illinois, and I have built a successful career as a real estate agent. I worked hard to get here, years of effort, long nights, and pushing through obstacles. I own my own house, a luxury car, and had financial security. I believed I had everything a woman could ask for. And I thought I had a loving husband, Ryan. Ryan and I had been married for 6 years, but we had known each other longer. We met at an event where I was helping clients find properties, and he was there as a car dealer trying to promote his business. He had this charming personality, a smooth talker, and knew how to make a woman feel special. Back then, I admired his energy, his laughter, and the way he always made things fun. He was 2 years younger than me, but I didn't care. Age wasn't important. I believed in love, trust, and partnership. At first, things were great. He was attentive, caring, and affectionate. We traveled together, shared our dreams, and built a life I thought would last forever. I didn't mind that I earned more than him. I believed we were a team, and what was mine was his too. But over time, Ryan changed. He quit his job as a car dealer because he said he was tired of working for others. Instead, he became obsessed with social media, trying to become an influencer. He spent all his time posting videos, chasing trends, and trying to gain followers. He promised me that one day, he'd be successful, and we'd never have to worry about money again. Months turned into years, and nothing changed. He wasn't making real money. Instead, he became lazy, selfish, and completely dependent on me. I paid for everything: the bills, the groceries, the house, the car, the vacations. He barely lifted a finger at home. He wouldn't clean, cook, or even take care of small things like fixing the Wi-Fi. If I ever asked him for help, he'd wave me off and say, "Relax, babe, you can afford a maid." I tried to talk to him, reason with him, but he always had an excuse. "Ava, you don't understand how social media works. It takes time. You're so controlling. Just let me do my thing. Why are you always nagging me? You knew who I was when you married me." I still held on, hoping he'd change, but deep down, I was growing exhausted. And then came the biggest betrayal of all. For a long time, I had this gut feeling that something wasn't right. Ryan had become distant, spending hours locked in a room, whispering on his phone. He started going out late at night, claiming he had meetings with brands and sponsors. He suddenly became secretive with his phone, turning the screen away when I walked by. Whenever I asked, he'd brush it off. "You're overthinking, Ava. Stop acting like I'm some kind of criminal. You're too busy with work to even spend time with me. Why do you care now?" I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust my husband. But the truth had a way of coming out. One night, I was organizing paperwork for our home when I found a medical bill tucked away in a drawer. At first, I thought it was an old bill of mine, but when I looked closer, my heart stopped. It was a hospital bill for a child's birth, dated 5 years ago. The father's name? Ryan Parker. My hands trembled. I stared at the paper, reading it over and over, hoping I was wrong. My husband had a child? A 5-year-old child. I felt like my whole world had shattered. The man I had supported, trusted, and loved had been living a double life. I had no idea who this child's mother was, but I knew one thing: I was done being a fool. The next morning, I confronted Ryan. I held up the hospital bill and demanded, "Explain this." For the first time in our marriage, he had nothing to say. He looked at the bill, then at me, and his face went pale. "Ave, he stammered, but his silence told me everything. "You lied to me." My voice shook. "You had a child with another woman and kept it a secret." Then, just like that, his guilt disappeared, and a smirk appeared on his face. "So what if I did?" he said coldly. "It's none of your business." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "None of my business. I'm your wife." He sighed and leaned back against a couch. "Listen, Ava, we've had a good run, but let's face it, you're always working, and we barely see each other. Maybe it's time to move on."
Move on.
Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "You disgust me, Ryan." That was the last conversation we had before I left for my 10-day business tour in New York. I needed to get away, clear my head, and plan my next steps. I couldn't stay married to a man who had betrayed me like this. But fate had other plans. Just 2 days later, my business trip was suddenly canceled. My company had to reschedule the meetings, so I booked an early flight home. I didn't tell Ryan I was coming back. I didn't want to see his face. I just wanted to pack my things and figure out my next move. But when I walked into my house that night, I never expected what I saw next. There, standing in my living room, was Ryan, and next to him, a young woman with dark hair, holding the hand of a small child. They were living in my house, sleeping in my bed, using my money. And that was the moment everything changed forever. I stepped into my house, expecting silence, but instead, I heard laughter. At first, I thought maybe Ryan had company over, some friends, maybe. But then I saw them. Ryan was standing in my living room, relaxed, laughing at something. And next to him, a woman, young, dark-haired, and holding the hand of a little boy. The woman was comfortably dressed in my robe, her bare feet resting on my coffee table, and the child had toys spread all over my expensive rug. It felt like I had walked into a nightmare. I froze in place, my suitcase still in my hand. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Ryan turned, and for a split second, I saw shock flash across his face. But then, just as quickly, he smirked.
Oh.
You're back early. His voice was so casual, like I had just come home from a walk. I felt like I couldn't breathe. My home, the one I built with my hard work, was being used like a hotel for my cheating husband and his mistress. Who is she? I finally managed to say, my voice shaking with fury. The woman stood up, smirking just like Ryan. She had no shame. I'm Sophie, she said smoothly. Ryan's girlfriend. And this is our son, Liam. My whole body turned cold. Our son? I looked at the boy. He was 5 years old. The same age as the child from the hospital bill I had found. The truth hit me so hard that I staggered back. Ryan had a whole family behind my back. You brought them into my house? I gasped, my hands shaking. Ryan rolled his eyes, acting bored. Relax, Ava. You were gone for work. We needed a place to stay. You needed a place to stay? My voice rose. You have a child with another woman, and instead of being a man and telling me, you sneak her and the kid into my home? Sophie laughed. Oh, Ava. Don't act so innocent. You were never around. Ryan and I, well, we've been together for a while now. I could barely see straight. All those nights Ryan disappeared, all the times he lied about meetings and business deals. It was her. You cheating bastard, I spat at Ryan. I gave you everything. I paid for this house, this life. I supported you when you had nothing, and this is how you repay me? Ryan let out a sigh, completely unfazed.
Yeah, well.
You had your fun. It's time for me to take my share now. My share? I repeated, barely able to process what he was saying. Ryan stepped closer, his smirk widening. We might as well make this simple, Ava. Sign the house and car over to me, and we'll be out of your way. I laughed bitterly. Are you out of your mind? Why the hell would I do that? Sophie's eyes darkened, and in a flash, she grabbed my arm. Before I could react, Ryan yanked my suitcase out of my hand and kicked the door shut. You're going to sign the papers, Ryan said, his voice cold now. I tried to pull away, but Sophie's grip was tight. Ryan, let me go. No, he said simply. Not until you give me what I want. That's when it hit me. They weren't going to let me leave. I felt my stomach drop. Ryan grabbed my wrist, squeezing hard. We're not playing games, Ava. We're done pretending. I struggled, my heart pounding in fear. You're insane. Sophie shoved me backward, and before I could react, I was pushed into the guest bedroom. Ryan slammed the door behind me, and I heard the lock click. I ran to the door and banged on it. Let me out. From the other side, I heard Sophie's mocking voice. Just sign the transfer papers, Ava. It's easier that way. I screamed in rage, pounding on the door. They had locked me in my own house, trying to force me to hand over everything I owned. I looked around the room. No phone. No way to call for help. My body trembled in panic. How long would they keep me here? What if they hurt me worse? And then, I heard Ryan's voice outside the door. You've got two choices, Ava. Sign the papers, or we make your life a living hell. I sank to the floor, tears burning in my eyes. I felt helpless. But I wasn't going to let them win. I wasn't going to give up. Then I heard something that made my heart stop. Sophie said, and if she doesn't sign, we'll have to make her. Ryan's voice dropped into a low whisper, but I still heard him.
Yeah.
We'll make her. I shivered. They were serious. They were going to force me one way or another. My mind raced. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to fight back. And then, just as I was losing hope, I heard something outside the house. A voice. A woman's voice. It was Lisa, my best friend, my neighbor. Ava, I jumped to my feet and banged on the wall as hard as I could. Lisa, help me. Outside, silence. Then I heard her footsteps running away. And I prayed, please, please let her do something. Minutes passed. Then, from outside, I heard it. Sirens.
Loud.
Blazing. Getting closer. Ryan and Sophie panicked. The cops. The cops are here. Sophie shrieked. Shut up. We can't let them find her. Ryan hissed. I heard them running through the house, trying to escape. Then suddenly boom. The front door burst open. Chicago police. Hands in the air. The sound of rushing footsteps filled the house. A moment later, the lock on my door clicked and the door swung open. A police officer stood there, looking at me with concern. Ma'am, are you okay? I burst into tears. I had been trapped, helpless, and scared, but now I was free. The officers rushed after Ryan and Sophie, but they were already gone. They had escaped.
For now.
But I wasn't going to let them get away with this. Not after what they had done. I stepped out of the room, my hands clenched into fists. I was going to make them pay, no matter what it took. The moment I stepped out of that room, my entire body was shaking. I wasn't sure if it was from rage, fear, or relief. Maybe all three. The police officers guided me out of the house, their voices calm and reassuring, but my mind was elsewhere. Ryan and Sophie had escaped. Lisa ran up to me the moment I stepped outside, her face full of worry.
Ava.
Oh my God, are you okay? I could barely speak. My throat felt raw from screaming for help. The moment she hugged me, I broke down. You saved me, Lisa, I whispered. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't called the police. She pulled back, gripping my shoulders. I knew something was wrong when I heard you screaming. Ava, what did they do to you? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. They wanted me to sign over the house and the car. When I refused, they locked me in a room. They were going to force me. My voice cracked at the last part. Ryan, he hit me. Lisa's eyes flashed with fury. That son of a... The officer beside me interrupted. Ma'am, we're going to need you to come down to the station to file an official report. We need to put out a warrant for Ryan Parker and Sophie Mills. I nodded without hesitation. I had spent years supporting that man, believing in him, hoping he'd change.
And in return?
He cheated, betrayed, and tried to steal everything I built.
No.
He wasn't getting away with it. At the station, I told them everything. From the moment I met Ryan, how he changed after marriage, how I discovered his affair, and how he and Sophie trapped me in my own home, demanding I hand over my property. The police were horrified. You're lucky your neighbor acted fast, one officer told me. This could have been much worse. I swallowed hard. I knew what he meant. Ryan and Sophie were getting desperate. If Lisa hadn't heard me, they might have done something even worse. But now it was my turn. I wasn't just going to let them run away and start a new life on my money. Ryan thought he could break me, but he had no idea who he was dealing with. The very next day, the police issued a public warrant for Ryan and Sophie. Their faces were all over the news, and their names were posted on crime alerts online. They thought they could hide, but I knew Ryan too well. He was too arrogant to disappear quietly. And I was right. 2 days later, I got a call from one of the officers.
We've found them, he said.
A woman recognized them at a cafe in downtown Chicago. They're trying to act normal, but we're moving in now. I rushed to the station, my heart racing. By the time I arrived, it was over. They had been arrested in public, humiliated in front of dozens of people. Ryan had tried to run, but he wasn't fast enough. Sophie had screamed and fought, but in the end, they were dragged away in handcuffs. When I saw them sitting in that holding cell, it was Ryan who looked at me first. His face was filled with pure hatred. You set me up, he snarled. I tilted my head. Oh, I thought you said I was overthinking things, that I was too busy with work to notice what you were doing. His jaw tightened. You ruined me. I laughed softly. You ruined yourself, Ryan. I'm just the one who made sure the world saw it. Sophie suddenly lunged forward, her eyes wild with rage. You think you've won? You think putting us in here changes anything? I looked at her with nothing but disgust. You came into my home.
You tried to steal from me.
You trapped me, threatened me, and laughed in my face. I took a step closer, lowering my voice. Now, you're exactly where you deserve to be. She screamed something at me, but the guards dragged her away. I turned back to Ryan, giving him one final glance. I gave you everything, I whispered, and you threw it all away. Enjoy your new life, Ryan. I hear prison food is terrible. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. He knew. This was the end. I walked out of that station lighter than I had felt in years. The nightmare was finally over. But I wasn't done yet. The court case was still ahead, and I was going to make sure they paid for every single thing they did to me. And I wasn't going to stop until they were locked away for a long, long time. The courtroom was cold and sterile, yet every seat was filled. Reporters, strangers, even some familiar faces from my past, all watching, waiting to see how this story would end. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands steady, my heart calm. This was it. The final step to ensure that Ryan and Sophie faced justice for what they had done. Across from me, Ryan looked worn out, defeated. His usually well-groomed hair was a mess, his confidence shattered. Sophie sat beside him, her once smug expression replaced with something close to fear. The judge entered, and silence filled the room. Ryan's lawyer stood up first, trying to paint me as the villain. Ava Parker is a successful real estate agent. She had financial control in this marriage. My client was simply left without options. I nearly laughed out loud. Without options? I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm. He had every option. He could have worked, contributed, been a husband. Instead, he chose to cheat, steal, and abuse. Ryan glared at me, but he knew he had nothing left to argue. I laid out everything. The years of financial support, the secret affair and their child, the night they trapped me in my own home, the threats, the violence, the police rescue. The evidence was overwhelming. Lisa testified. She told the court how she heard my screams and called 911. The police officers testified. They explained how they found me locked away, how Ryan and Sophie fled like criminals. The medical report proved Ryan had hit me. Bank records showed he had drained money from our joint accounts. Security footage from the cafe showed their arrest. Sophie lost control first. "You don't understand," she screamed at the judge. "We deserve that money. Ava has everything. A career, a house, a car. She wouldn't even notice if we took a little." The judge raised an eyebrow. "A little? You attempted to steal her home and her assets while holding her against her will." Sophie sat back, her mouth snapping shut. Then it was Ryan's turn. "Your Honor, I made mistakes," he said, his voice forced, trying to sound pitiful. "But I just wanted a chance. Ava never loved me. She only loved her work." "Objection," my lawyer cut in. "This is irrelevant." "Overruled," the judge said. "Mr. Parker, you are not the victim here." Ryan looked at me, his desperation finally showing. "Ava, please," he said, his voice lower. "You're really going to send me to prison?" I tilted my head, staring at the man I once thought I loved. "You had every chance to do better, Ryan. Every chance to be better. Instead, you threw it all away. I don't owe you anything." His face twisted into pure hatred. "You ruined my life." I finally let out a small, satisfied smile.
"No, Ryan."
"You ruined yours." The judge didn't take long to make the ruling. Ryan and Sophie were found guilty on multiple counts.
Fraud.
Domestic abuse. Unlawful imprisonment. Attempted theft. Ryan was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Sophie, because of her active involvement, got 8 years. The moment the sentence was read, Ryan slammed his fists on the table, shouting, "You're a monster, Ava. I hope you rot alone." Sophie screamed, trying to lunge at me, but the bailiffs held her back. I simply stood up, collected my things, and walked out of the courtroom, free. For the first time in years, I could breathe. In the days that followed, I made a clean break from my past. I sold the house where all the bad memories lived. I got rid of the car Ryan had once begged to drive. I moved into a brand new luxury apartment in downtown Chicago. Lisa came over one night with wine, sitting on my new couch with a grin. "You did it," she said, raising her glass. "You got your revenge." I swirled my drink, thinking for a moment. "It wasn't revenge," I said finally. "It was justice." Lisa laughed. "Call it whatever you want. The important thing is you're free." I looked out the window, the city lights glowing below. She was right. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't trapped in a toxic marriage. I was finally free, and I would never let anyone take that from me again. I created the auto-drive software that turned our company into a multi-million-dollar empire. But in a single meeting, my father announced my stepsister, a woman with a fake degree and zero experience, as the new CEO.
"She deserves it more than you," he said.
I laughed in their faces and walked away. The next morning, when they arrived at the office, they were blindsided. They never saw the storm coming. I never thought my own father would betray me. Not like this. For years, I had dedicated myself to something I truly believed in, an autonomous vehicle system that could change the world. A self-driving technology designed not just for convenience, but for real safety. No more distracted driving, no more reckless accidents, no more human error causing senseless deaths. It wasn't just another tech project to me. It was my life's work. I had spent 7 years refining algorithms, testing prototypes, and running simulations over and over until they were perfect. It meant countless sleepless nights, living off caffeine and sheer determination. I had sacrificed relationships, vacations, weekends, everything, to build something that I knew would make a difference. And then, in a single moment, my father, Richard Walker, the man I once looked up to more than anyone else in the world, tried to take it all away. The signs had been there for a while, but I had ignored them. At first, it was small things. My access to key project files was suddenly restricted due to company security policies. Meetings about the future of the project happened without me, even though I was the one who built it. My role as lead developer was gradually diminished, my input ignored, and my authority undermined. I tried to convince myself it was just restructuring. Maybe my father wanted more oversight. Maybe he wanted to involve new perspectives. Then Lily arrived. Lily, my 26-year-old stepsister, the golden child of my father's second marriage. She had no background in engineering, software development, or AI technology, but that didn't stop her from walking into Walker Autotech as if she had earned her place there. She had a business degree from some sketchy, unaccredited online university, but my father acted like she was a prodigy. "She understands business," he told me one evening when I confronted him about her sudden involvement in the project. "She knows how to market innovation, how to turn ideas into profits." That's where you struggle, Jennifer. You think like an engineer, but she thinks like a CEO. I wanted to laugh. She had never even worked in a tech firm before. She had no real-world experience managing anything. And yet, somehow, she was supposed to understand my project better than I did? At first, I tried to work with her. I explained the system, walked her through the testing phases, showed her the core mechanics that made our AI-driven software unique. I hoped that if she actually learned, maybe we could work together. But she didn't want to learn. She wanted control. Every time I brought up the technical aspects of the system, she dismissed them. "This is all too complicated," she said in one meeting, rolling her eyes. "You need to find a way to explain this in simple terms, Jennifer. Investors don't care about the details." I stared at her. The details were everything. Without the details, our technology was just another useless gimmick. That was the moment I realized that Lily didn't care about innovation. She cared about taking credit for something she didn't understand. The final blow came during an all-hands meeting. I sat in silence as my father introduced Lily as the new head of strategic development for the autonomous vehicle project, my project. I turned to him, expecting some kind of explanation. Instead, he said, "Lily will be taking a more hands-on approach from now on. You'll still be involved, of course." Still be involved? I was being replaced. After the meeting, I confronted him in his office. "Dad, what is this?" I demanded. "Lily doesn't even understand how our system works." He sighed, as if I was the unreasonable one. She doesn't need to understand the technical details, Jennifer. That's what we have engineers for. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I am the engineer, Dad. I built this. He gave me a patient smile, the kind that made me feel like a child. And no one is saying you didn't. But Jennifer, you're not a businesswoman. You don't know how to commercialize this. Lily does. She has the business, mind you lack. I wanted to scream. I had spent years developing this technology, making sure it was safe, efficient, and groundbreaking. And now, because of his wife's influence, he was handing everything over to Lily, who had done nothing to earn it. But I didn't argue further. I had already seen this coming. Months earlier, I had sensed something was wrong. My father had started restricting my access, excluding me from meetings, downplaying my role in front of clients and investors. I had spoken to Emma Collins, my best friend and an intellectual property lawyer, and she had given me one piece of advice. Document everything. File your own patent. Protect yourself. So I did. Every late-night test run, every algorithm tweak I had made on my personal time, every breakthrough that wasn't funded by Walker Autotech, I kept records. I made sure I had proof that the core innovation was mine. I didn't tell my father. I didn't tell Lily. I played along, waiting for the moment they made their move. And that moment came one evening, when my phone rang. It was my father. Jennifer, I need to inform you that Walker Autotech is officially transferring all rights to the autonomous vehicle project to Lily. She'll be handling everything moving forward. For a moment, I couldn't even speak. It felt like someone had knocked the air out of me. You can't do that, I said finally, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned white.
His voice was calm. Too calm.
Of course I can. Walker Autotech funded this research. It belongs to the company. And as CEO, I decide who runs it. I could picture him in his office, sitting behind his massive desk, convinced that I had no choice but to accept his decision. I swallowed the rage burning inside me and forced myself to stay calm. Well, I said, my voice steady, I hope Lily enjoys trying to commercialize something she doesn't understand. There was a pause. He had expected me to fight, to beg, to plead. My composure threw him off balance. That's all, he said stiffly. I'll have legal send over the transfer papers. Good luck with that, I replied and hung up. The moment the call ended, I sent a quick text to Emma. He did it, just like we predicted. She responded instantly. We're ready. I took a deep breath and pulled out a folder from my desk labeled Project Shield, my insurance policy. It contained everything. Patent filings, records of my independent work, proof that the heart of this technology belonged to me, not Walker Autotech. My father thought he had won. He had no idea what was coming. I sat in my office, staring at the folder in front of me. Project Shield. Months of careful planning, of documenting every piece of my research, of preparing for this very moment. My father thought he had won. He thought I'd just accept it, that I'd let Lily, someone who had never written a single line of code, take credit for something she couldn't even begin to understand. He had no idea what was coming. I grabbed my phone and called Emma. She answered on the first ring. I assume he made it official? Yeah, I said, leaning back in my chair. He called me himself. Told me Walker Autotech was transferring everything to Lily. Emma let out a short laugh. He really thinks he owns it? He thinks whatever the company funds belongs to him, I said, shaking my head. But I was careful. All my key breakthroughs? My own time, my own equipment. I logged everything. Then we move forward, she said. I'll file the challenge first thing tomorrow. The moment they try to submit that transfer, the USPTO will flag it. We'll have a full investigation on our hands. I exhaled slowly. This was really happening. What do I do now? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. You wait. And when they realize what's happened, you don't give them anything. No reaction. Let them sweat. I smiled. I liked that plan. The next morning I got to the office as usual. Acted normal. Pretended like nothing had happened. Let them think I was defeated. And then I watched as everything started to fall apart for them. By noon, the first email from Walker Autotech's legal department had arrived, requesting I sign documents confirming the transfer. I forwarded it to Emma without even opening it. By 3 p.m., my father called me again. I let it go to voicemail. By 5 p.m., Emma sent me a text. It's flagged. The USPTO has officially opened an investigation. Now, we see how they react. I knew exactly how my father would react. Badly. The next morning, I walked into the office and saw Lily pacing in the hallway, phone pressed to her ear, looking flustered. She spotted me immediately and rushed over. Jennifer, we need to talk. I stopped walking, raised an eyebrow. Do we? You're making this difficult, she snapped. We need you to sign off on the patent transfer so we can move forward with launching. I almost laughed. She actually thought I was going to help her steal my work. Lily, I said, my voice calm. Why don't you explain to me, right here, what the core algorithm of the system does? She blinked. What? The core algorithm, I repeated. The one that makes the system actually work. Since you're taking over, you should be able to explain it, right? Her face turned red. That's not my job. I focus on business strategy. I said, nodding. So, you don't actually understand what you're trying to take over. She clenched her jaw. You're being ridiculous. Just sign the papers. I smiled. Good luck with that. I walked away, leaving her standing there, fuming. By noon, my father was at my office door. He didn't even knock, just walked in and shut the door behind him. His face was tight with frustration. Jennifer, what the hell are you doing? I sat back in my chair, crossed my arms. I don't know what you mean. You know exactly what I mean, he snapped. The USPTO flagged the patent transfer. They're saying the technology is already under an independent patent. Yours. I shrugged. That's interesting. His eyes narrowed. You knew this was coming. I didn't say anything. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're jeopardizing the future of this company.
No, Dad.
I'm protecting my work. His face hardened. I built this company. I took care of you after your mother died. You think you're entitled to something just because you wrote some code. That hit me harder than I expected. Not because I believed him, but because it was the final confirmation I needed. He never saw me as an equal. Just an extension of his business, a resource to be used. I stood up. I don't owe you anything. And I'm done letting you take from me. He exhaled sharply. So, what's your plan? You think you can take down Walker Autotech? I tilted my head. I don't have to take down anything. I just have to make sure you don't get to take credit for what's mine. His jaw clenched. You're making a mistake. I met his eyes.
No, you did.
The day you decided to put someone else's ambition above my work. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he straightened, smoothing out his tie. You're going to regret this. I didn't flinch. We'll see. He stormed out of my office, slamming the door behind him. I sank back into my chair, my heart pounding. Emma had been right. Let them sweat. By the next morning, things had escalated even more. Emails were flying, meetings were happening behind closed doors. I walked past my father's office and saw Walker Autotech's legal team huddled together, whispering. Then at lunchtime, my phone buzzed. A news alert. I froze. Clicked the link. Walker Autotech announces breakthrough in autonomous vehicle technology, led by Lily Walker. I stared at the screen. Read it again. They were announcing it anyway. Even after everything, even knowing I had the patent, they were still trying to take credit for it. I immediately called Emma. Did you see it? She asked. Yeah, I said, voice tight. What do we do? We file the lawsuit. Right now. I didn't hesitate. Do it. By the end of the day, Emma had submitted the emergency injunction. Walker Autotech had just made a very big mistake. The moment Emma filed the lawsuit, everything changed. Walker Autotech had thought they could get away with it, that they could announce my technology as their own, slap Lily's name on it, and move forward without consequences. They assumed I wouldn't fight back. They assumed I would give up. They were wrong. The day after the lawsuit was filed, I arrived at my office to find everything in chaos. My father's office door was shut, but I could hear raised voices inside. The legal team was scrambling, employees were whispering in the hallways, and even Lily, who always carried herself with an air of smug confidence, looked shaken. By mid-morning, I got a call from Emma. "Jennifer, it's happening. The Federal Trade Commission just opened an investigation. They're looking into Walker Autotech's claim over the technology." I let out a slow breath. It was all unfolding exactly as we had planned. By noon, my father called me again. This time, I answered. "Jennifer." His voice was sharp, but there was an underlying tension beneath it. "Dad, this lawsuit, it's unnecessary. You're overreacting." I almost laughed. Overreacting? After he had tried to erase me from my own work? "It's necessary," I said flatly. "You tried to take something that wasn't yours. That's theft."
He scoffed.
"The company funded this, Jennifer. It belongs to Walker Autotech." "No, it doesn't," I said. "And the patent office agrees with me." There was a long silence. Then his voice dropped lower. "Jennifer, listen to me. If you drop the lawsuit, we can work something out. I'll make sure you get credit. A top position in the company. More than fair compensation." I clenched my jaw. He still thought this was about money. About titles. "Dad, I don't want a position in your company," I said. "I want my work back. That's all." "Be reasonable," he snapped. "Lily is already in the public eye. The announcement has been made. If you push this, you'll only damage your own reputation." I shook my head. "You made the announcement without considering the consequences. Now you have to deal with them." I could hear his breath hiss through his teeth. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. "Jennifer," he said, his voice quieter this time, "I built this company for you." I felt a pang of something. Maybe it was old loyalty. Maybe it was grief for the father I used to believe in. But I pushed it down. "No," I said softly. "You built it for yourself. And now you're trying to take something I built." Silence. Then, without another word, he hung up. That night, the news broke. FTC launches investigation into Walker Autotech over patent dispute. It was everywhere. Industry blogs, tech news sites, financial reports. Everyone was talking about it. And then came the press requests. Reporters wanted to talk to me. They wanted to hear my side. At first, I hesitated. I had always let my work speak for itself. But Emma was clear. If you stay silent, they control the narrative. If you speak, you set the record straight. So I did. The next morning, I sat down with one of the biggest business journalists in the industry and told my story. I told them about my work, about the years I had spent developing the technology. I told them how my father had gradually pushed me out, how he had handed it over to someone who didn't understand it, how they had tried to erase my contributions. And I made one thing crystal clear. Walker Autotech is not only trying to take credit for my work, but they're pushing an unsafe product into the market. This technology requires expertise, careful implementation, and ethical leadership. Instead, they're prioritizing PR and stock value over actual innovation. The article exploded. The industry was furious. Other engineers, former employees, even competitors, people who had their own grudges against Walker Autotech, began coming forward with their own stories. The cracks in my father's empire were widening. Then came the next big blow. One afternoon, Emma stormed into my office, phone in hand. "Jennifer, turn on the news."
"Now."
I grabbed the remote and flipped to the business channel. The headline scrolling across the screen made my heart stop. Walker Autotech under federal scrutiny for fraudulent safety testing. I turned to Emma, eyes wide. "What?" "It's worse than we thought," she said, setting her phone down. The FTC investigation uncovered evidence that Walker Autotech has been faking safety reports, rushing testing phases to get the autonomous system to market faster. I sat down hard. I had suspected my father's company had been cutting corners, but this was criminal. "Jennifer," Emma said slowly, "this isn't just about you anymore. The government is involved now. If the safety reports were falsified, people's lives are at risk." I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. My father hadn't just tried to steal from me. He had put lives at risk just to beat the competition. That night, my father called again. I almost didn't pick up, but something in me needed to hear what he had to say. "Jennifer," he said, his voice flat. "Are you happy now?" I exhaled slowly.
No, Dad.
"I'm disgusted." There was a pause. "They're coming after me," he admitted. "The board is panicking. Investors are pulling out. They want me to step down." For the first time, I heard fear in his voice. "Then step down," I said. "Take responsibility." A bitter laugh. "That's not how it works." "Then you'll lose everything." Silence. Then his voice cracked. "What do you want from me, Jennifer? Money? Control of the company? Just name it, and I'll make it happen." I stared at the wall, shaking my head. He still didn't get it. "I don't want your company, Dad. I never did." Another long silence. Then, finally, "I see." And then he hung up. The next morning, it was official. Richard Walker resigns as CEO of Walker Autotech. The company's stock crashed. Investors abandoned ship. Lily, now fully exposed as a fraud, disappeared from public view. And then came the offers. Major industry leaders, investors, they wanted to back me. They wanted to fund the future of my technology. I sat across from Daniel Parker, one of the biggest names in the autonomous vehicle industry, as he slid a contract across the table. $80 million, he said simply, to develop Walker Autonomous Systems the right way. Under your leadership. I ran my fingers over the paper, my mind racing. My father had tried to take everything from me. Instead, he had handed me my greatest opportunity. I picked up the pen. Let's build something better. Signing that contract was the moment I officially stepped out of my father's shadow. Walker Autotech had tried to erase me, but in the end, they had only made me stronger. I walked out of that meeting with $80 million in funding and the full backing of some of the most influential investors in the tech industry. Walker Autonomous Systems was real now, not just an idea, not just a fight for my stolen work, but a company of my own. I didn't waste time. The moment the funding was secured, I moved fast. I set up operations, hired engineers I trusted, brought back the best minds that my father had pushed out of Walker Autotech. I didn't just want to build my technology, I wanted to build it right. Meanwhile, Walker Autotech was burning. The safety fraud scandal had completely destroyed their credibility. Investigations were piling up, former employees were testifying against them, and the government was now involved. The lawsuits weren't just for me anymore. They were coming from investors, regulators, even the families of people who had unknowingly participated in Walker Autotech's rushed testing trials. Then one day, Lily called. I stared at her name on my phone for a long time before answering. "Jennifer, I know you don't want to talk to me, but I don't know who else to call." Her voice was small, uncertain, not the arrogant Lily I had known before. "What do you want?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated. God, I messed up, okay? I let Mom push me into something I wasn't ready for. I thought I could handle it. I thought Dad would protect me. But her voice broke. "Everyone's turning on me. The media, the board, even Mom. She's acting like she had nothing to do with any of this." Of course she was. Sophia had gotten exactly what she wanted, her daughter at the top, at least for a moment. But the second things fell apart, she must have abandoned Lily to clean up the mess herself. "You did this to yourself," I said bluntly. "You let them use you, and you let them steal from me." "I know," she whispered. "I know. But I want to fix it." I sighed, rubbing my temples. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" There was a long silence. Then she said, "I want to learn. Really learn." I enrolled in an engineering program. A real one. That surprised me. "Why?" "Because I don't want to just pretend anymore," she admitted. "I want to actually understand the work I was trying to take credit for." I didn't know how to respond to that. She sighed. I just wanted you to know." I was quiet for a long moment. Then I said, "If you're serious, then good. But don't expect me to forget what you did." "I don't," she said softly. "But I'll prove to you that I can be better." I didn't know if I believed her, but I also knew that she was the least of my concerns now. Walker Autotech was collapsing. My father had been forced to step down, and without him, the company was leaderless, desperate, and bleeding money. Then, one day, I got a message from someone I hadn't expected. My father. Can we meet? I almost ignored it. Almost. But some part of me, maybe out of curiosity, maybe out of closure, wanted to hear what he had to say. So I agreed. We met in a quiet cafe, far away from the chaos of the corporate world. He looked different, older, defeated, smaller. His usual confident presence was gone. He sat across from me, stirring his coffee in silence.
Finally, he sighed.
I lost everything, Jennifer. I didn't say anything. The company, the board is considering selling it off. I built it from the ground up, and now it's worthless. You did that to yourself, I said, not unkindly but firmly. You put profit over safety, over ethics. You let Mom manipulate you. You let Lily take something she wasn't prepared for. And you tried to erase me. He exhaled sharply, looking down. I know.
That startled me.
I hadn't expected him to admit it so easily. He looked back up at me, and for the first time in a long time, he looked tired. Not the powerful CEO, not the ruthless businessman. Just a man who had made too many mistakes. I was wrong, he said finally. About everything. I swallowed. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to hear it. Because I don't have anything left to lose. I stared at him for a long time. Part of me wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that maybe if he had realized this sooner, things could have been different. But it was too late now. I stood up, pulling my coat over my shoulders. Goodbye, Dad. He looked up at me, eyes sad. Goodbye, Jennifer. I walked out of that cafe and didn't look back. Over the next few months, Walker Auto Tech crumbled completely. Investors pulled out, lawsuits piled up, and eventually, the board had no choice but to sell off what was left of the company. The name Walker Auto Tech disappeared from the industry. But Walker Autonomous Systems? We thrived. The first prototypes of my self-driving technology hit the market under my leadership. We did it the right way. No shortcuts, no faked tests, no rushing to be competitors. Just real, solid engineering that was built to change the world.
And it did.
The industry recognized it.
Governments wanted partnerships.
Investors flooded in. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't fighting to prove my worth. I had already won. One evening, after a long day at work, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Just my name on the front. I opened it to find a notebook. I froze. It was my mother's old engineering journal, the one she used when she first started in the industry. I flipped through the pages, running my fingers over her notes, her calculations. On the first page, in faded ink, was a message she had written long ago. To my Jennifer, who sees the world not just as it is, but as it could be. Never let anyone dim your light or steal your dreams. You are capable of more than they know. I traced the words, swallowing the lump in my throat. For the first time in years, I felt at peace. I had fought for what was mine. I had reclaimed my future. And now it was time to build something even greater. After the tragic accident, I was hospitalized in the ICU and fell into a coma. My greedy husband assumed I would never recover. He gained control of my savings accounts and assets, brought in a new mistress, and enjoyed a lavish vacation. But after recovering, I returned with a shocking revenge that forced him to live on the streets. I used to believe my life was perfect. Looking back now, I realize it was nothing more than an illusion, a carefully crafted lie that I had been living in for years. My name is Elena Carter, and I was once a respected corporate lawyer in Chicago. I had built my career from the ground up, working tirelessly to earn my place among the city's top legal minds. At 35, I had everything: a prestigious job, a beautiful home, financial stability, and, most importantly, a man I thought was my partner in life. Ryan Carter, my husband of 8 years, was a successful real estate developer. We were the power couple, admired by many, envied by others. Or so I thought. Ryan was charming, confident, and knew exactly how to make people believe in him. Including me. I had no reason to suspect anything. I was too busy working on high-profile cases, too distracted by the never-ending demands of my career to notice the cracks forming in my marriage. Maybe that was my biggest mistake, trusting too much. Then, everything changed on one stormy night in October. I had spent the entire day at work, preparing for a major trial. It was late when I finally left the office, the rain pouring heavily as I drove home. I remember glancing at my phone, seeing Ryan's text, "Be home soon." Even in that moment, I felt comforted knowing he was waiting for me. But that feeling didn't last long. As I turned onto a dark, empty street just minutes from home, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. The car behind me was speeding, closing in fast. At first, I thought it was just another reckless driver, but then it happened. The car slammed into my back bumper. My hands clenched the wheel as I tried to steady myself, but before I could react, the car hit me again, harder this time, sending me spinning. My tires skidded against the wet pavement. My heart pounded. I tried to regain control, but then a final impact. Everything went black. When I woke up, I wasn't at home. I wasn't in my bed, wrapped in the warmth of my husband's arms. Instead, I was lying in a cold hospital bed, surrounded by the rhythmic beeping of machines and the sterile scent of antiseptics. My body ached, every muscle screaming in pain. I couldn't move. A nurse appeared, offering me a reassuring smile. "You're awake, Miss Carter. You've been unconscious for weeks."
Weeks?
My breath caught in my throat. I tried to piece together the last thing I remembered, the rain, the headlights, the impact. But the details were hazy. Then the doctor came in. Dr. Laura Bennett, a highly respected neurosurgeon, explained everything. The crash had left me with severe internal injuries, a fractured leg, and a head injury that put me in a coma for nearly a month. The fact that I survived it all was a miracle. I asked for Ryan. I expected him to burst into the room, relieved, his face filled with love and worry. But he didn't. He never came. Instead, the doctor's expression turned uneasy. "Your husband hasn't visited, Miss Carter." The words hit me harder than any crash ever could. I stared at her, waiting for her to say it was a mistake. But she didn't. In the following days, I learned the full extent of his betrayal. Ryan hadn't just ignored my accident, he had used it to his advantage. The moment he assumed I wouldn't survive, he took control of my finances. My assistant, who had visited me in the hospital, whispered the ugly truth. "Ryan transferred all your funds. He said it was for your medical expenses, but he's been taking trips, Elena."
He's not alone.
Not alone. My blood ran cold. A name I had only heard in passing, a 28-year-old social media influencer, known for flaunting designer clothes and luxury vacations on Instagram. Ryan's mistress. It wasn't just the money. He had drained my savings, maxed out my accounts, and even sold some of my properties to fund his new lifestyle. He wasn't by my side because he was too busy spending my money on Vanessa, taking her on lavish vacations to Miami, Paris, and Dubai. I lay in that hospital bed, feeling my entire world crumble around me. The man I loved, the man I had trusted with my life, had discarded me the moment I was no longer useful to him. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms.
Pain.
Betrayal. Rage. Ryan thought I was gone. He thought he could erase me, take my life, and move on as if I never existed.
But I survived.
And I wasn't just going to sit back and watch him get away with it. I was going to make him pay. I spent the next few weeks recovering, but my mind was no longer focused on healing. It was focused on retribution. My first call was to David Martinez, a private investigator and an old friend I had once helped with a legal case. David was sharp, resourceful, and had a talent for uncovering secrets. When I told him what had happened, he didn't hesitate. "We'll bring him down, Elena. I promise you that." I needed proof, solid evidence that Ryan had committed fraud, that he had stolen from me, betrayed me, and left me for dead. David assured me that within a few weeks, he would gather everything I needed. Meanwhile, I focused on regaining my strength. I forced myself to walk, to move, to fight through the pain. Every step, every breath was fueled by one thought: revenge. Ryan thought I was out of the picture, but he had no idea what was coming for him. I wasn't just going to take back what was mine. I spent weeks in the hospital, not just recovering, but plotting. Every painful movement, every sleepless night fueled my determination. I wasn't just healing, I was preparing for war. David was already working in the background, digging up everything he could on Ryan. Every day, I waited for his calls, eager to hear what new piece of Ryan's treachery he had uncovered. I wanted proof. Undeniable, solid proof that would rip his life apart, just like he had tried to do to mine. Then one evening my phone rang. It was David. His voice was calm, but there was a sharpness in his tone that told me he had found something big. "Elena," he said, "you're not going to believe this." I held my breath as he continued. "Ryan didn't just empty your accounts. He's been forging your signature on documents, selling your properties, and taking out loans under your name." I felt my fingers tighten around the phone. "How much?" "Close to $2 million in total. And get this, he's already moving to sell your penthouse. The paperwork is almost finalized." I shook with rage. That penthouse was mine. I had bought it with my money, my hard work, and he was just selling it like it meant nothing? I exhaled slowly. "We need to stop him." David chuckled. "Oh, don't worry. We will. But first, we gather more. The bigger the case we build against him, the harder he falls." I knew he was right. I had to be patient, but patience was the last thing I wanted right now. Still, I played along. A few days later, David sent me photographs. Ryan and Vanessa in Miami, lounging at a beachside villa, funded with my money. The sight of Vanessa, draped in a designer dress and expensive jewelry, made my stomach turn. David dug deeper, pulling bank records, emails, and legal documents. I had always known Ryan was selfish, but what I saw now was beyond greed. He had made sure to erase me completely from his life, while using every single resource I had worked for to build a new one for himself. But what infuriated me most was how easy he thought this was. He hadn't just stolen my money, he had stolen my identity. He had forged documents, ensuring that everything was transferred into his name, thinking I would never return to claim what was mine. Well, he was wrong. I left the hospital sooner than expected. My doctor was hesitant, but I assured her I could manage. I had too much work to do. The first step? Regaining control of my finances. I met with my bank, bringing David's gathered evidence. The manager was stunned by what he saw: the forged signatures, the illegal transactions. I filed official fraud charges against Ryan, freezing all accounts linked to him. Within 2 days, his world began to crack. I imagined the moment he tried using my money and found everything blocked. The panic, the confusion, it was only the beginning. David had one more surprise for me. "Ryan has been bragging about an investment deal with some very important people," he said one night. "He's about to meet them in a few days." A real estate deal? That was perfect. I had spent years in corporate law, and I knew exactly how to ruin him. I called in a favor from an old friend in the legal world, someone Ryan wouldn't see coming. Together, we drafted an anonymous legal notice exposing Ryan's fraud and financial instability. It was sent directly to his investors the night before his big meeting. The next morning, Ryan arrived at the meeting, expecting to secure millions in funding. Instead, he was met with angry investors, slamming documents onto the table, demanding answers. David was there, watching from the corner of the room, discreetly recording as Ryan's perfect world started falling apart. I wasn't done yet. Next, I went after Vanessa. She thought she could steal my life and walk away untouched? Not a chance. I gathered proof of her involvement in Ryan's financial fraud: emails, messages, receipts. She wasn't just a clueless mistress. She was in on it, helping Ryan forge documents and make illegal transactions. David hand-delivered the evidence to the authorities. Within days, Vanessa's accounts were frozen, and she was under investigation for fraud and tax evasion. Her shrieking meltdown on social media was everything I had hoped for. "This is a mistake. I didn't do anything wrong," she wailed in a video, her perfectly curated influencer persona crumbling before thousands of followers. Ryan, now financially paralyzed, had no way to help her. The best part? My next move would leave them both with nothing. I filed an eviction order against Ryan, reclaiming my mansion. He had no idea it was coming until security arrived at his doorstep, giving him exactly 1 hour to vacate. When he called me, furious, demanding answers, I finally answered. Elena, what the hell is going on? You can't do this. I laughed, a cold, sharp sound. Oh, Ryan. I can and I already did. This is my house, he yelled. I smiled.
No, Ryan.
It's mine. Always has been. Then, I hung up, picturing him standing outside in the cold, watching security throw his expensive suits onto the pavement. He still didn't know the worst part. I had one final strike left to deliver. And this one, it would destroy him completely. The moment I hung up on Ryan, a strange kind of calm settled over me. But it wasn't peace. It was the silence before the final storm. He had tried to erase me. He had left me for dead, stolen everything I had worked for, and paraded around with his new mistress, thinking I'd never come back. But now, his perfect little world was collapsing, and I wasn't even done yet. I woke up the next morning with a sense of purpose. There was only one thing left to do, finish this once and for all. David had sent me a message before sunrise. Ryan's scandal had hit the media. The first article appeared before noon. Disgraced real estate developer accused of financial fraud. Ryan Carter's luxury life built on stolen money. Betrayed wife fights back. Exposes husband's crimes. The headlines were brutal. They painted him as a con artist, a fraud who had built his empire on stolen money and deception. By early afternoon, the calls started. David kept me updated. Ryan's investors were furious. They had trusted him with millions, and now they were pulling out one by one, cutting ties before his downfall could drag them down too. His former colleagues turned their backs on him. The same people who had once shaken his hand, smiled at his charm, and called him a genius, were now distancing themselves as fast as they could. I imagined Ryan sitting in whatever expensive hotel he had left, scrolling through the news, his hands shaking, his mind racing. Everything he had spent years building was falling apart in a single day. But I wasn't done yet. That night, my phone rang. It was David, and this time, I heard satisfaction in his voice. Elena, he said, you're going to love this. I leaned back, gripping the phone. Tell me. Ryan's been arrested. I felt my heart stop for a second.
What?
David let out a dark chuckle. One of his investors filed fraud charges against him this morning. The police picked him up outside a cheap motel. I closed my eyes, letting the news sink in. So, this was how it ended for him. Not just broke, humiliated, abandoned, but now in a jail cell. The man who had once walked through the most prestigious offices in Chicago, who had once laughed at the idea of consequences, was now sitting behind bars. For a second, I thought about going to see him, standing on the other side of that glass, watching him beg for help. But no, that would be too easy for him. I wanted him to feel the weight of everything he had done, with no one there to save him. Ryan had spent years lying, stealing, and manipulating his way to the top. And now he had finally lost. Of course, Vanessa was nowhere to be found. The moment she realized Ryan was no longer useful, she vanished. She had built her entire life on other people's wealth, feeding off their success like a parasite. And now that Ryan had nothing, she had no reason to stay. She tried reaching out to me once. A long, pathetic email. Elena, I had no idea what Ryan was doing. I was just caught up in everything. Please, you have to believe me. I had nothing to do with it. I'm just as much a victim as you are. I stared at the message for a long time. Then, without hesitation, I deleted it. She deserved everything coming her way. But I wasn't done yet. With Ryan gone, it was time to rebuild. The first thing I did was reclaim everything he had stolen. My bank accounts, my properties. I made sure his name was erased from every single thing he had once tried to take from me. I didn't just want my life back. I wanted to rebuild it into something even stronger. So, I made a decision. One that changed everything. I had spent my whole life working in corporate law, representing the wealthy, protecting the powerful. But after what I had been through, I realized something. I didn't want to fight for the rich anymore. I wanted to fight for women like me, women who had been cheated, manipulated, and left behind. So I quit my high-profile job, and I started something new. A law firm dedicated to helping women who had suffered betrayals, women who had lost everything to men like Ryan. And for the first time in my life, I felt powerful. Not because of what I had, but because of what I had survived. Then, a few weeks later, David sent me a picture.
Ryan.
He was sitting on a sidewalk. His once expensive suit was now wrinkled, stained, unrecognizable. His hair was unkempt, his face a shadow of the man he used to be. This was the man who had once mocked me, betrayed me, left me to die. And now he had nothing. I stared at the image for a long time. Then I slowly reached for my phone and pressed delete. Because Ryan Carter was no longer a part of my story. The days following Ryan's downfall felt surreal. For the first time in years, I woke up without a sense of dread, without the weight of his betrayal pressing against my chest. It was over. He was done. But despite everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was one final chapter left to be written. Ryan had fallen, but I needed to see it for myself. So one cold evening, I did something I never thought I would do. I went to find him. David had told me where he was, a rundown homeless shelter on the outskirts of Chicago. He had nothing left. No home, no money, no reputation. Everything he had stolen from me had been taken back, and his fraud case ensured that no one in the business world would ever trust him again. I stood outside the shelter for a long time, watching through the glass windows as people shuffled in and out. Then I saw him. At first, I wasn't even sure it was him. The man I had once known, the one who had spent years dressing in the finest suits, who had always carried himself with arrogance, was now unrecognizable. Ryan sat hunched over at a small table, staring at an untouched plate of food. His once perfectly groomed hair was now greasy and disheveled, his sharp suit replaced with a faded sweatshirt and worn-out jeans. For a long time, I just watched him. No pity, no regret. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing he had finally lost. Then, as if sensing my presence, he lifted his head. His eyes met mine through the glass. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker in his expression, shock, disbelief, and something else, something like fear. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room smelled of cheap soup and damp clothes, a stark contrast to the lavish restaurants where Ryan had once dined. Every eye in the room turned toward me, but I ignored them. I walked straight to his table. Ryan looked like he had seen a ghost. "Elena," his voice was hoarse, weak. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. "You look terrible." He let out a dry, humorless laugh, running a shaky hand through his unwashed hair. I don't even know what to say." I leaned forward slightly. "You don't have to say anything. I just came to see it with my own eyes." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You won. You destroyed me." I tilted my head, studying him. This was the same man who had left me for dead. The man who had stolen my money, my home, my identity. The man who had thought I would never fight back. "I didn't destroy you, Ryan," I said calmly. "You did that all on your own." He swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he rubbed them together for warmth. "I was stupid," he muttered. I thought I could get away with it. You thought I would stay weak," I interrupted. "You thought I would never come back."
He didn't respond. He didn't need to.
Ryan Carter, the man who had once believed himself untouchable, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. He let out a deep breath, looking down at his hands. "I have nothing left." For the first time since I had walked in, I smiled. A slow, deliberate smile. "Good," I said softly. His eyes snapped up to mine, wide with desperation. "Elena, please. I made a mistake. I was selfish. I wasn't thinking. I lost everything. Maybe we can fix things." I let out a short laugh, shaking my head. "Fix things? I don't have anyone else," he whispered. "Vanessa's gone. My friends abandoned me. I have no job, no home. I don't even know where to go after this. I stared at him for a long time, then leaned in closer. You want my forgiveness, Ryan? He nodded quickly, his eyes pleading. Yes, Elena. Please. I cut him off with a slow shake of my head. No. His lips parted slightly, as if he hadn't fully processed what I had just said. I stood up, pulling my coat tighter around me. You don't deserve forgiveness. You deserve every single thing that's happened to you. Elena, please, he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll do anything. I met his eyes one last time, completely unaffected by his desperation. You once told me I was too serious, I murmured, that I needed to learn how to let go. I stepped back, letting my gaze drift over his pathetic figure one final time. Well, Ryan, I said with a small, satisfied smile. Consider this me letting go. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. As I stepped outside into the cold night air, I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air of freedom. Ryan was gone from my life forever. And for the first time in a long time, I felt light, unburdened,
Free.
I had spent so many years building my career, working endlessly for success. I had spent even longer trapped in a toxic marriage, tied to a man who had never truly valued me.
But now?
Now my life belonged to me again. I went back to my office, the office that I had built from the ground up. The firm dedicated to helping women like me, women who had been betrayed, women who had been told they weren't strong enough to fight back. Every case I took, every woman I helped, felt like another victory. I was no longer the woman who had once given everything to a man who had never deserved her. I was Elena Carter, and I had won. After my grandpa's funeral, my greedy parents and brother believed that the entire $90 million inheritance and business would be transferred to my brother. But when my grandma read the will, they were stunned. All the family business and inheritance were transferred to me, and they received nothing. Filled with anger, they threw chairs in frustration. Then suddenly my grandma took a bold step. What happened next was unbelievable. I never thought I'd come back home like this. Not with grief sitting so heavy on my chest, not with unanswered questions gnawing at my mind. But here I was, standing in front of my grandmother's house in New York, feeling like a stranger at the place that once felt like my only safe haven. I took a deep breath and knocked. The door swung open, and there she was, Margaret Carter, my grandmother. But something was different. The warmth that had always been in her eyes when she saw me was gone. Instead, she stared at me like I was a ghost, someone she had long buried. So, now you decide to show up? Her voice was cold. I flinched. Grandma, what's going on? My voice was unsteady, the weight of the moment crushing me. I came as soon as I heard about Grandpa. She let out a bitter laugh. As soon as you heard? You expect me to believe that? My heart pounded. What are you talking about? Her expression hardened. Your grandfather called you over and over, Emily. He was asking for you on his deathbed. He wanted to say goodbye to his little doctor, but you never answered. You never even bothered to visit. How could you be so cruel? The words hit me like a slap. No, that's not possible, I whispered, my hands shaking. I never got any calls. I would never ignore Grandpa. Margaret folded her arms, her sharp eyes narrowing. Then how do you explain this? She disappeared inside for a moment and returned with a small notepad. My hands trembled as I took it from her. The number scribbled in Grandpa's familiar handwriting wasn't mine. I stared at the unfamiliar digits, my stomach twisting. This isn't my number, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I've had the same number since high school. Grandma, they gave him a fake number. Her eyes flickered with something, doubt, pain, maybe even realization. What do you mean? She asked, her voice softer now. I swallowed hard. I came home during my university break to see you and Grandpa. Nathan was here. He wouldn't let me in. He said no one was home. Then Mom and Dad told me you and Grandpa were in a nursing home. Margaret's face went pale. A nursing home? We never. Her voice cracked as she stopped herself. Her hands were shaking. I felt sick. Mom and Dad told me that you were both moved to a nursing home because Grandpa needed care. I kept asking where, but they always had an excuse. And then they told me about the funeral. Her lips parted in shock. They told us you didn't want to come. I clenched my fists. They told me the funeral was at 3 p.m. I showed up at the church at 2:30, but it was already over. When I asked them, they acted like I had mixed up the times. But I didn't. I wrote it down. I know what I heard. Margaret sank into the porch chair, her entire body trembling. The funeral was at 11 a.m., Emily. My knees buckled. I gripped the railing for support, my world tilting. They lied to both of us, I whispered. They made sure I missed Grandpa's last moments. They made sure I missed his funeral. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall.
Not yet.
Margaret finally looked up at me, her eyes filled with sorrow and something else, regret. They stood in that church and told everyone you didn't care, she whispered. Your mother, your father, and Nathan. They told everyone you had abandoned your grandfather. Nathan even cried, saying he had tried so hard to reach you. I couldn't breathe. They made me believe it, Margaret continued, her voice breaking. I was angry. I thought my Emily, my granddaughter, had turned her back on us. But now, she let out a shaky breath. Now, I don't know what to think anymore. I dropped to my knees beside her chair. Grandma, I loved Grandpa. I still do. He was the only one who ever believed in me. He never made me feel like I wasn't good enough. Margaret reached out, her fingers brushing against my cheek, like she was trying to see if I was real. Then just like that, the dam broke. We collapsed into each other's arms, sobbing. All the pain, all the years of deception, all the grief poured out right there on that front porch. When we finally pulled away, Margaret wiped her tears with the sleeve of her sweater and squared her shoulders. Enough, she said, her voice steady now. We know the truth. That's what matters. But there's something else you need to know. I sniffled, my head still spinning. What is it? She stood up, her expression turning sharp again, not with anger at me, but with determination. We need to talk about your grandfather's will. I frowned. His will? She nodded, her jaw tight. I never read it before because I was too heartbroken. But now, I think it's time we see what James really wanted. A chill ran down my spine. Your parents and Nathan think they've won, she continued. They think they've erased you from our lives. But they're wrong. I wiped my eyes and sat up straighter. What are we going to do? Margaret grabbed the phone from the side table. Her fingers trembled slightly, but her voice was firm as she dialed. Mr. Harrison? Yes, it's me. We need to arrange a meeting. No, it can't wait. I watched as she set the phone down, her eyes blazing with the same fire I used to see in Grandpa's when he fought for what was right. They'll be here in an hour, she said. And the lawyer is coming too? A slow, cold realization settled over me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just the forgotten daughter, the one who was cast aside. I was about to fight back. I sat in the living room, my hands clenched tightly together as I waited. The weight of everything that had just happened pressed down on my chest. The lies, the betrayal, the years of manipulation. Across from me, Margaret Carter, my grandmother, sat with a calmness that felt unnatural. But I knew better. This wasn't calm. This was the silence before storm. They think they can just rewrite the truth, she muttered, more to herself than to me. They think they can erase you, make you the villain. Well, not today. A sharp knock at the door made me sit up straight. They're here, Grandma said, her voice steely. She gave me a look. Stay here. I obeyed, staying in the kitchen just as she had asked. I could hear their voices immediately. Nathan, my mother Victoria, my father Jonathan. Their presence filled the house like an unwanted shadow. Mother, you could have called us earlier if you needed something. My mother's voice rang out, smooth as ever, but I could hear the impatience beneath it. We have been handling everything since Father's passing, Nathan added, his tone filled with exaggerated concern. We've made sure everything was taken care of, just as he would have wanted.
Lies.
All of it. Grandma didn't waste time.
Sit down.
Mr. Harrison will be here shortly. We need to discuss James' will. That seemed to catch them off guard. There was a brief silence before my father spoke. The will? Yes, Grandma said. I realized I never actually sat down to read it. I think it's time we go through it properly. My mother cleared her throat. There's no need for all that, Mother. We already told you. Nathan and I have taken care of everything. We honored Dad's wishes. Grandma let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. Oh, I'm sure you did. Another knock. The front door opened. Mr. Harrison, the family lawyer, stepped inside, carrying his briefcase. Good evening, everyone, he said, nodding politely. Then his eyes landed on Nathan, my mother, and my father. His expression hardened just slightly. Shall we begin? He said, pulling out a set of documents. I took a deep breath. This was it. Grandma's voice rang out firm and clear. Emily, come in. I stepped out of the kitchen and into the living room. Dead silence. Nathan's face froze mid-smirk, his expression turning to shock. My mother's polished demeanor cracked just a little, and my father, well, he didn't say anything, but I could see the tension in his posture. Emily Carter wasn't supposed to be here. Emily? My mother blinked, quickly recovering. I wasn't expecting you. I folded my arms. Clearly. Nathan let out a scoff. Well, this is awkward. He turned to Mr. Harrison. Can we just get on with it? The lawyer cleared his throat.
Certainly.
I have here the official last will and testament of Dr. James Carter. Silence settled in the room as he unfolded the papers. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. As per Dr. Carter's final wishes, Mr. Harrison began, all financial assets, properties, and business holdings, including the Carter Medical Clinic, are to be transferred to his granddaughter, Dr. Emily Carter. The air in the room shifted instantly. Nathan sat up so fast that his chair scraped against the floor. Excuse me? Mr. Harrison didn't even blink. I heard what you said. Nathan snarled, turning red. His eyes snapped to my grandmother. Mother, tell me this isn't real. Grandma didn't flinch. It's real. I watched as my mother's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers tightening on the armrest. My father remained silent, his face blank. But that's impossible, Nathan sputtered.
What about me?
What did Dad leave me? Mr. Harrison flipped a page. Dr. James Carter left you nothing. The words cut through the room like a knife. Nothing. Nathan's jaw dropped. That's ridiculous. He turned to my parents, his voice rising. Mom? Dad? Say something. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was dangerously soft. This must be a mistake. It's not, Mr. Harrison said. Dr. Carter made it very clear. His granddaughter, Emily, worked hard, followed in his footsteps, and cared for people. Nathan, on the other hand, he glanced at my brother. Well, Dr. Carter saw, through certain behaviors. Nathan shot up from his chair, knocking it over. His face twisted in pure rage. This is unfair, he shouted. Dad always said I'd take over everything. He always told me I'd be the one to handle the family business. Grandma's voice cut through his tantrum like ice. Your father believed in earning, Nathan. You never worked a day in your life. Nathan's hands curled into fists. His face darkened with fury. This is your fault, isn't it? He turned his glare on me. You did this. I stayed calm. Grandpa made his own decisions. Like hell he did. Nathan spat. You were always the perfect one, the little doctor, the golden child. And what about me?
Huh.
Where was my chance? I stared him down. You had plenty of chances. You just wasted them. Nathan's eyes flickered with something, hatred, resentment, maybe even desperation. He turned back to Mr. Harrison. This isn't final. We can contest this. Mr. Harrison didn't even blink.
You can certainly try.
But Dr. Carter made sure his wishes were legally airtight. Nothing is going to change. Silence. Then, Nathan snapped. Before anyone could react, he grabbed a glass paperweight from the table and hurled it against the wall. It shattered on impact, shards flying everywhere. My mother gasped, standing up. Nathan, enough. But he wasn't done. He stormed toward me, his face contorted with rage. I stood my ground. Grandma's voice rang out, firm and unwavering. Nathan Carter, you need to leave.
Now.
Nathan froze. He looked at her, his own mother, and then at my father. But my father, for once in his life, didn't defend him. He just stared at the floor. Nathan let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. His gaze locked onto mine one last time. You'll regret this, he whispered. Then he turned and stormed toward the door, slamming it shut behind him. A heavy silence settled over the room. Mr. Harrison sighed. Well, that was dramatic. Grandma shook her head. That boy. She turned to my mother and father. You raised him like this. You let him believe he was entitled to everything. And now look at what you've created. My mother lifted her chin. We were just trying to do what was best for our son. You mean your favorite child? I said quietly. Neither of them answered. Mr. Harrison packed up his papers. If there's nothing else, I'll be taking my leave. He nodded at me. Congratulations, Dr. Carter. As he left, Grandma turned to me. Are you okay? She asked softly. I took a deep breath. I will be. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Nathan wasn't finished yet. The house was eerily silent after Nathan left. The tension still clung to the air like a thick fog, and I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. I had won, but it didn't feel like a victory, at least not yet. Grandma sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Well, she sighed, that went about as terribly as expected. I let out a shaky breath. He's not going to let this go. My mother, Victoria, who had remained silent since Nathan's outburst, finally spoke. You could have handled this better, Emily, she said, her voice sharp. I turned to her, anger simmering beneath my skin.
Me?
You're blaming me? Jonathan, my father, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, but as usual, he let my mother do all the talking. You knew how much this meant to Nathan, she continued, standing up and smoothing out her dress. Your grandfather should have split things equally. He should have considered Nathan's future too. I scoffed. He did consider Nathan's future. And he saw exactly what kind of person Nathan had become. That's why he left him nothing. Victoria's face hardened. You were always the selfish one. You never thought about how your success made Nathan feel. Something inside me snapped. Made him feel. My voice rose. Are you serious? I spent my entire childhood being pushed aside, ignored, treated like I was an afterthought while you and Dad poured everything into Nathan. And now you're blaming me because Grandpa saw through all of it. Jonathan sighed heavily, finally speaking. Look, Emily, your mother, and I just wanted what was best for both of you. I laughed bitterly. No, you wanted what was best for Nathan. I was never part of the equation, was I? Neither of them answered. Grandma finally stood up, looking at them both with cold disappointment. You raised a boy who believes the world owes him something. And now he's out there, furious and dangerous because, for the first time in his life, he didn't get what he wanted. That's on you. Victoria opened her mouth to argue, but Grandma raised a hand. Enough.
Get out.
My mother blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. Get out of my house, Grandma said, her voice calm but final. Your son just tried to attack Emily, and you're standing here justifying it. I don't want to see either of you again. Victoria's lips pressed into a thin line, her face turning red. You'll regret this, she said through clenched teeth. No, Grandma said. You will. Jonathan hesitated for a second, looking between us. I thought, just for a moment, that maybe, finally, he would say something, do something to acknowledge the years of neglect. But he didn't. He just sighed, took my mother's arm, and led her out. The door shut behind them, leaving only me and Grandma. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding.
Well, that was
necessary, Grandma finished. We sat in silence for a moment before she reached over and squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Emily. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Grandpa would have been proud, too. Her eyes softened. He was always proud of you. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nathan's face, furious, unhinged. I knew him well enough to know this wasn't over. He was going to come back. And I needed to be ready. The next morning, I was at the clinic, trying to focus on work, when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I had a bad feeling before I even answered. Hello. Slow, familiar voice greeted me. Hello, little sister. My stomach turned to ice. Nathan, you think you've won, don't you? He said, his tone dripping with resentment. You think you can just take everything and walk away? I tightened my grip on the phone. I'm not taking anything. Grandpa left it to me, because he knew I would actually do something with it. Nathan let out a sharp laugh. Oh, I see. So now you're the noble one? The perfect little doctor, saving the world while your poor brother is left with nothing? You made your choices, Nathan. Grandpa saw through you. His voice dropped into something darker. Well, let's see if you're still feeling so high and mighty when I'm done. The line went dead. I sat there, gripping my phone, my heartbeat hammering in my chest. He wasn't finished, and I had no idea what he was planning next. I sat frozen for a moment, my phone still clutched in my hand. Nathan's voice echoed in my head. Let's see if you're still feeling so high and mighty when I'm done. I knew my brother. This wasn't an empty threat. He was desperate, furious, and most of all, he was dangerous. I immediately called Grandma. Nathan just called me, I said as soon as she answered. He's planning something. There was a pause. Then, her voice came firm and unwavering. Come home.
Now.
I didn't argue. Within 15 minutes, I was pulling into Grandma's driveway. As I got out, I scanned the street, expecting Nathan to be lurking somewhere, but there was no sign of him. Inside, Grandma was already making calls. I'm getting the security system updated.
I don't trust him, she said.
I nodded, my pulse still racing. I don't either. She hesitated. Do you think he would? I knew what she was asking. Would Nathan actually try to hurt me? A few days ago, I would have said no. But after seeing his face when he was disowned, after hearing his voice on the phone, I wasn't sure anymore. Before I could answer, the sound of shattering glass erupted from the back of the house. Grandma and I both froze. Then she whispered, He's here. My heart pounded. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the police, but before I could dial, Nathan's voice rang out from the back hallway. Emily. Grandma and I slowly turned toward the sound. Nathan stood there, his face flushed, his eyes wild. He had broken in through the back window. Glass still clung to his clothes. He looked unhinged. Give me my money, he seethed. My fingers hovered over my phone. Get out, Nathan. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh.
No.
You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to take everything from me. Grandma stood up, her voice steady despite the fear I knew she must have felt. Your father left you nothing, Nathan. That was his decision. Nathan's hands clenched into fists. It should have been mine. It was supposed to be mine. His breathing was heavy, erratic. He took a step forward. But you always took everything, didn't you? His eyes locked on me. The attention, Grandpa's respect, my inheritance. I cut him off. You never worked for any of it. Grandpa left it to me because I earned it. His face twisted with rage. Earned? You think, because you went off to medical school, you're better than me? He took another step forward. You think because you play doctor, that means you deserve everything while I get nothing? Get out of this house, Grandma ordered, her voice shaking with anger. But Nathan wasn't listening. His hands were shaking. His whole body looked like it was vibrating with fury. He lunged. I barely had time to react. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my skin. Give it to me, he shouted. Give me my share. I struggled, wrenching myself free. Let go of me. Nathan, stop. Grandma's voice rang out, but he wasn't stopping. His hands went for my purse, where my car keys, my phone, and my wallet were. He was trying to take something from me, anything. But I fought back. Get out. I screamed, shoving him back with all my strength. Nathan stumbled, but didn't fall. His eyes were blazing. And then, the siren sounded. He froze. I didn't even have to look. I knew Grandma had called the police. Nathan's face paled. His chest heaved as he looked between me and Grandma. Then, like the coward he was, he ran. The back door slammed. I ran to the window just in time to see him sprinting down the alleyway behind the house. But it was too late for him. The police were already pulling up, blocking off the street. They caught him within minutes. Nathan was arrested for breaking and entering, attempted assault, and property damage. My parents, who had spent years enabling him, didn't even show up at the station to bail him out. Grandma and I pressed charges. It was the final nail in the coffin. I knew that some part of me would always remember the brother I grew up with. But the man he had become, he was a stranger to me now. I didn't lose a brother that night. I lost him years ago. It's been 4 years since that night. Nathan was sentenced to 3 years in prison. When he got out, he tried contacting me, but I never responded. As for my parents, I haven't spoken to them since. They made their choice a long time ago. Grandma and I still live in the house. I run the Carter Medical Clinic just as Grandpa always wanted. His legacy is alive in every patient I help, in every life I save. One day, while going through Grandpa's old things, I found a photo of us. I was just a kid in the picture, sitting on his lap as he showed me a medical journal. On the back, in his handwriting, were just 7 words. My little doctor will heal the world someday. I smiled, holding the photo close, because I finally knew the truth. Family isn't about blood. Family is about who stands beside you when the rest of the world turns its back. And I had everything I needed. The end. I never expected my father to leave me with nothing. But when his lawyer read the will, my younger brother, Daniel, sat back and laughed, basking in his victory. He was the chosen one, the sole heir, while I was cast aside like I never existed. But Mom had always warned me, when the time comes, you'll know where to look. That night, I unlocked the safe she left behind. As I pulled out the papers inside, my brother's smirk disappeared. His laughter turned into sobs, because inside the safe was the one thing that could destroy him forever. I always knew how this would end. Sitting in my father's lawyer's office, listening to the final words of a man who never saw me as enough, I wasn't surprised. I should have been used to it by now, the way my father, William Carter, dismissed me, the way he always made it clear who his favorite child was. Ryan Carter, my younger brother, sat beside me, his arms crossed, his usual cocky smirk plastered across his face. He didn't even try to hide his amusement as the lawyer, Richard Dawson, read the will. And to my son, Ryan Carter, I leave Carter Enterprises, including all assets, properties, and financial holdings. Ryan barely moved, but I could feel the satisfaction radiating off him. Richard cleared his throat and continued, "To my daughter, Olivia Carter, I leave a small box containing family photographs and personal mementos." Silence filled the room. Ryan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head as if this was all just a formality, a joke that played out exactly as expected. "Well, Olivia," he said, leaning back in his chair, "guess Dad really wanted you to have something sentimental, huh? Should make up for, well, everything else." I didn't flinch. I just stared straight ahead, my hands folded neatly in my lap. This moment, this very scene, I had rehearsed it in my head so many times. My father's voice, even in death, still found ways to push me aside, to remind me I was never the child he wanted. Ryan had always been the golden boy, the one who fit the mold. While I chose science, nature, and a life of research, Ryan followed in our father's footsteps, business deals, networking, wealth. He took the job at Carter Enterprises the moment he finished college, while I pursued environmental science, a field my father openly mocked. "You know how Dad felt about your career choices," Ryan continued, his voice dripping with false sympathy. I turned to him, meeting his gaze for the first time since we walked into the office. I know exactly how he felt. Richard Dawson cleared his throat again, clearly eager to end this meeting without any drama. "If there are no disputes, we can conclude here." I stood up, smoothing my coat. "Are we done, Ryan?" Ryan shrugged, flashing his perfect, rehearsed smile. "Unless you'd like to contest Dad's wishes?" I shook my head.
No.
I got exactly what I expected. And with that, I walked out. The drive home was quiet, the Chicago skyline casting long shadows as the sun dipped lower. My townhouse wasn't anything extravagant, but it was mine, fully paid for, mortgage-free. It was a home I had built for myself, without my father's money, without anyone's approval. As I stepped inside, I headed straight to my office. I knew exactly where it was, the envelope my mother had given me 2 years ago. I had never opened it, never even dared to peek. "Wait until after your father is gone," Mom had whispered to me the last time we sat together. Her voice had been weak, her hands frail, but her eyes had been sharp. "Promise me, Olivia." I had promised. And now it was time. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk and carefully pulled out the thick envelope. My name was written in my mother's elegant handwriting. My hands trembled slightly as I peeled back the flap and slid out the contents. There were documents. A lot of them. Real estate deeds. Investment portfolios. Bank statements. Company shares. My heart pounded as I flipped through them, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. Then, at the very top, I found a letter. "My dearest Olivia, if you are reading this, your father is gone. And I have no doubt that he has done exactly what I feared. I knew he would leave you nothing, that he would give everything to Ryan, just as he always planned. But I need you to understand something. Your father was not the only one building a legacy. For the last 20 years, I have been investing, quietly, carefully. Your research, your dedication to environmental science, it inspired me. While your father dismissed it as foolish, I saw what you saw. And so, I built something of my own. Every investment, every asset, slowly and legally transferred into your name.
It is yours, Olivia.
And it is worth far more than Carter Enterprises. Your father never knew. And Ryan has no idea. Use it wisely, my darling girl. The future is yours now."
All my love, Mom.
I sat there, my mother's words sinking in, the weight of what she had done pressing down on me. My father had spent his life believing he controlled everything, that he had the power to shape the future. But my mother, the quiet, overlooked woman in the background, had outplayed him. And Ryan? He thought he had won. He thought he had it all. But he was about to learn the truth. I spent the night going through every document. $300 million in assets. Properties across the country. Investments in renewable energy, sustainable technology, conservation programs. My mother had built an empire that aligned with everything I believed in, and it was all mine. By the time the sun rose, I knew exactly what I had to do. At 9 a.m., I sent Ryan a message. "Come to my house.
Now.
There's something you need to see." 15 minutes later, he pulled up in his sleek black car, stepping out in a perfectly tailored suit. He looked as confident as ever, like he owned the world. "Olivia," he said, smirking. "What's so urgent?" Having second thoughts about taking Dad's old photos. I didn't respond. I simply stepped aside and let him in. "Have a seat," I said, motioning toward the dining table. Neatly arranged on the polished wood surface were the documents, the investments, the bank statements, the signed legal transfers. Ryan's smirk faded the moment he picked up the first page. His brow furrowed. His fingers tightened around the paper. This he swallowed hard, flipping to the next page. Then the next. "Where the hell did you get this?" I leaned back against the chair, arms crossed. "Mom left it for me. Turns out, while you and Dad were busy controlling Carter Enterprises, she was building something else. Something bigger." Ryan looked up, his face suddenly pale.
No.
"No, this isn't real." "It's very real," I said. "Everything is verified. Every document is legal. Every cent is accounted for. And it's all in my name." Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he set the papers down. This is worth more than Carter Enterprises." I nodded. 10 times more. He shook his head, breathing heavily.
"No.
This isn't happening." I tilted my head, studying him. "You always thought Dad was the mastermind, that he was the one controlling everything. But Mom, she was 10 steps ahead of all of you." Ryan's jaw clenched. What do you want, Olivia? I smiled. I don't want anything, Ryan. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. But you? You just lost everything. And you don't even know it yet. Ryan's face was unreadable, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the slight twitch of his fingers as he clutched the papers. His entire life, he had believed he was untouchable, the chosen one, the heir to our father's empire. And now, sitting at my dining table, flipping through documents that proved otherwise, he was realizing that everything he had taken for granted had just slipped through his fingers. This isn't possible, he muttered under his breath. I tilted my head, watching him. Why not? Because, he let out a sharp breath and shook his head. Because Mom didn't know business. She didn't make investments. She didn't. She did. I interrupted. She just never let you or Dad know. While the two of you sat in boardrooms, pretending to run the world, Mom was playing the long game. Ryan's lips pressed into a thin line. He picked up another document, scanning it like he was searching for a mistake, some loophole, anything that could disprove what he was seeing. But there was nothing. 300 million, he whispered. This is worth more than everything Dad left behind. I shrugged.
Yeah.
It is. Silence filled the room. Then he laughed. A short, humorless chuckle as he leaned back in his chair. So what now, Olivia? He said, looking up at me with narrowed eyes. You're gonna throw this in my face? Rub it in? Maybe you want to buy me out of my own company. I exhaled slowly, keeping my expression neutral. I don't want Carter Enterprises. Ryan flinched slightly, as if the words physically stung him. You don't, he scoffed. Of course you don't. You wouldn't know how to run it anyway. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's exactly what Dad used to say about Mom. Ryan's face darkened. He didn't like that comparison. I leaned forward, my voice calm, measured. She was smarter than both of you. And now, everything she built is mine. So tell me, Ryan, what does that make you? His expression hardened, but I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Ryan had spent his life believing he had won by default, that his position in our family meant he would always come out on top. But now, for the first time in his life, he was losing. He shoved the papers away and stood abruptly. This doesn't change anything. I arched a brow. Doesn't it? He didn't answer. Instead, he stormed toward the door, yanking it open so hard it slammed against the wall. You think this means you've won, Olivia? He turned back to me, his jaw tight. We'll see about that. Then he was gone. I sat there for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had stood. I had expected anger, denial, but something about the way he left unsettled me. Ryan wasn't just mad. He was planning something. I knew him too well, and I had a feeling he wasn't going down without a fight. I spent the rest of the day preparing. My first call was to Emily Foster, my mother's lawyer, who had helped her manage these investments for years. She picked up on the first ring. Right on schedule, Emily said, her tone light, but I could hear the seriousness beneath it. I assume Ryan knows now. Oh, he knows, I said, rubbing my temple. And he's not taking it well. Emily sighed. I figured. Your mother predicted he'd try to challenge the holdings. I swallowed. Can he? No, a pause. But he'll try. That was what I was afraid of. My second call was to Dr. Ethan Blake, a leading researcher in renewable energy. He was the one my mother had been funding behind the scenes, pouring millions into sustainable technology development. When I told him who I was, he fell silent. Your mother was our anonymous benefactor, he said after a long pause. We've been trying to find a way to thank her for years. She believed in your work, I told him, and I want to keep supporting it. We made plans to meet later that week. Mom had built something incredible, and I wasn't about to let it die. By the time I finally sat down that evening, exhaustion crept in. Everything had changed in less than 24 hours, and I knew it was only the beginning. Then, just as I was about to turn off my phone, Ryan called. I hesitated before answering. Ryan, I said evenly. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then his voice, calm, measured, too controlled. We need to talk. I exhaled slowly. We already did.
Not like this, he said. Dinner.
Tomorrow night. Just us. I frowned. This wasn't like Ryan. He never asked. He demanded. Still, I needed to know what he was up to.
Fine, I said.
I'll see you tomorrow. The next night, we met at a high-end restaurant downtown, one of the places Ryan used to bring Dad's business partners to impress them. He was already seated when I arrived, his suit crisp, his demeanor perfectly composed. You look like you're taking this well, I said as I sat across from him. He gave me a slow smile. I always land on my feet, Olivia. I wasn't so sure this time. The conversation started off polite, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way. And I was right. Halfway through dinner, Ryan leaned forward. So, tell me, Olivia, he said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. What's your plan? I set my fork down. My plan? He gestured vaguely. You suddenly have all this money, all this power. What are you going to do with it? I studied him carefully. This wasn't just curiosity. He was trying to figure out his next move. I'm investing in something real, I said simply. Something that matters. Ryan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. You sound just like Mom. That wasn't an insult. But then, he leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. You know, Olivia, he said, his voice smooth, Carter Enterprises isn't doing so well right now. I didn't react. I could use a little help, he continued. A business investment. Something mutually beneficial. I almost laughed. You want my money? Ryan shrugged, as if it was the most reasonable thing in the world. It would be a smart move. Keep the family legacy strong. I met his gaze. There it was. The desperation creeping in. I'm not interested, I said simply. Ryan's smile didn't waver, but I saw his fingers tighten around his glass. You sure about that? I nodded. Very. He stared at me for a long moment, then leaned in slightly. And that's when his mask slipped. I wouldn't be so quick to dismiss me, Olivia, he said, his voice low. You might have all the money now, but I still have the connections, the power, and I can make things very difficult for you. I didn't blink. I had expected a fight, but I wasn't afraid of him. Try me, I said. Ryan's jaw tensed. For a split second, I thought he might actually lunge across the table. Then, just like that, his expression smoothed out. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. Well, he said, standing up and tossing a few bills on the table. I guess we'll see how this plays out. He turned and walked out without another word. I sat there for a long time, staring after him. I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. I knew Ryan well enough to understand that when he walked out of that restaurant, he wasn't admitting defeat. He was regrouping, planning, figuring out a way to take back what he thought was rightfully his. And I was right. The next morning, I woke up to 15 missed calls. Not just from Ryan, but from extended family members, old acquaintances, even Carter Enterprises board members. Word had spread fast. I barely had time to process the storm that was coming before my phone rang again. This time, it was Emily Foster. Olivia, she said straight to the point. Ryan's making moves. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Of course he is. What is it this time? He's calling in favors, she continued. Reaching out to influential investors, trying to paint you as a threat. He's telling them you're reckless, that you don't understand business, that you're putting Carter Enterprises in danger. I closed my eyes for a moment, forcing down the frustration. So, he's playing the victim now? Exactly, Emily said. And it's working. The board is panicking. Investors are nervous. They see you as a wild card, and Ryan is using that fear to rally support against you. I let out a slow breath. It wasn't enough for Ryan to have our father's empire. He needed to make sure I had nothing. He couldn't stand the idea of me winning. Let him try, I said finally. Emily hesitated. Olivia, this could get ugly. I know, I admitted. But I'm ready. I spent the rest of the day preparing. Ryan wanted to play dirty. Fine. I could play smarter. By the time evening rolled around, my lawyer, my financial advisors, and I had gone through every possible move Ryan could make. His best bet was to try and legally challenge my mother's holdings, to claim that she was unfit when she transferred them to me. But Mom had been 10 steps ahead of him. Every investment had been meticulously documented, every transaction legally airtight. There was nothing he could take from me. I was poring over the final details when my phone buzzed again. A text from Ryan. "We need to talk. Now." I almost ignored it, but something about his tone felt different. This wasn't cocky, arrogant Ryan. This was desperate Ryan. I sighed, grabbed my keys, and headed to the one place I knew he'd be, our father's old office. Ryan was already there when I arrived, sitting behind the massive oak desk that had once belonged to Dad. He looked rough. His usual flawless appearance was gone, his tie was loosened, his sleeves rolled up, his face tense. He gestured for me to sit. I didn't. "Say what you need to say, Ryan." He let out a breath, running a hand through his hair. "Carter Enterprises is sinking, Olivia." I leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "I know." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Of course you do. You've been waiting for this, haven't you?" I narrowed my eyes. "Don't twist this, Ryan. You did this to yourself. You and Dad ignored every warning, refused to adapt. You thought the world would bend to your will. But business doesn't work like that." Ryan sat forward, his elbows on the desk, his gaze sharp.
"We can fix it," he said.
"Together." I blinked. "Excuse me?" "You and me," he continued. "We merge what Mom built with Carter Enterprises. We take the investors who still trust me, combine them with your sustainability projects, and rebuild." I stared at him. He was serious. "You want me to save your company?" Ryan clenched his jaw. "It's our company, Olivia. The Carter name means nothing to me." I cut him off. "It never did." Ryan looked like he had been slapped. "You think I enjoy this?" he snapped. "You think I want to be sitting here, asking for help? I built this company. I worked for this. Dad trained me for this. And look where it got you," I said quietly. Silence. For the first time in his life, Ryan had no comeback. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "You don't understand, Olivia. If Carter Enterprises collapses, I lose everything." I tilted my head. "So, you only care now because it's your future on the line?" Ryan's jaw tightened.
"No."
"I care because," he hesitated. Then, softer, "because this is all I have left." I wanted to feel bad for him, but I couldn't. Not after everything. "Then maybe," I said, "you should have thought about that before you tried to destroy me." Ryan flinched. He looked away, running a hand through his hair. His voice, when he spoke, was hollow.
"So, that's it?
"You're just going to let me fail?" I sighed.
No, Ryan."
"You let yourself fail." I turned to leave, but he grabbed my wrist. Not rough, not aggressive, just desperate. "Please," he whispered. I hesitated. For the first time, Ryan wasn't talking like our father's son. He wasn't mocking me, manipulating me, trying to win. He was just my brother. And then, like a switch flipping, his grip tightened. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" he hissed. "You think you won?" I yanked my arm free. "You're unbelievable." He stood abruptly, knocking over a stack of papers. "You're walking away from family. You're turning your back on everything we built. You turned your back on me a long time ago, Ryan," I said, voice steady. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Do you know what happens to people like you, Olivia?" he said darkly. "People who don't know their place?" I swallowed. There it was. The real Ryan. I met his gaze, unflinching.
"Yeah, Ryan.
They win." I walked out. By the time I got home, I knew I had made the right decision. Ryan wasn't sorry. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for a way to stay in control. And I wasn't going to let him. The next morning, headlines broke. Carter Enterprises faces crisis. CEO under fire as investors pull out. The stock had dropped another 15% overnight. I expected Ryan to call, to lash out, to fight. But he didn't. Because Ryan was out of moves. And he knew it. I sat at my desk, staring at the final document I had been waiting to sign. The one my mother had planned for years. The one that would end Carter Enterprises for good. I picked up my pen.
And I signed.
Because this wasn't revenge. This was justice. I always thought revenge would feel different. That the moment I finally signed the papers, when I made the final move that would bring Carter Enterprises crumbling down, I would feel something.
Victory.
Satisfaction. Maybe even peace. But as I put the pen down and stared at my signature, all I felt was the weight of it. Ryan hadn't called me in 2 days. Not since the stock dropped, not since the board turned against him, not since the headlines started ripping him apart. I expected him to fight back, to lash out, to try one last desperate attempt to fix what was already broken. But there was nothing. That was how I knew he had finally realized the truth. It was over. I wasn't surprised when, a few hours later, my doorbell rang. I knew who it would be before I even opened the door. Ryan stood on my doorstep, but he wasn't the man I had last seen in our father's office. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was gone, and for the first time in his life, he looked lost. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he let out a slow breath. "Can I come in?" I stepped aside. Ryan walked in, looking around like he had never really seen my home before. Maybe he hadn't. In his mind, I had always been less than him, less important, less valuable, less worthy. Now I had everything, and he had nothing. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What do you want, Ryan?" He sat down at the dining table, the same table where I had first shown him Mom's documents. It felt like a lifetime ago. "I lost everything," he said quietly.
I didn't say anything.
"I thought I could fix it," he continued. "I thought," he ran a hand through his hair. "I don't know what I thought." "You thought you could control everything," I said. "Just like Dad did." Ryan let out a bitter laugh.
Yeah.
And look where it got me. He looked up at me, something unreadable in his eyes. "Do you hate me, Olivia?" The question caught me off guard. Did I? For years, Ryan had been the golden child, the one our father groomed, the one who had everything handed to him. And in return, he had laughed at me, belittled me, sided with Dad every time. He had been cruel, arrogant, selfish. But standing here now, stripped of everything, he wasn't that person anymore. I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I don't hate you, Ryan." He looked away, swallowing hard. "Mom would have hated what I became." I didn't argue. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table and slid it toward me. I hesitated before picking it up. It was a resignation letter. "I'm stepping down," he said. "The board already knows. They're bringing in a temporary CEO while they decide what to do next." I stared at the letter, then at him. "Why now?" Ryan exhaled. "Because I finally get it, Olivia." He leaned back, his voice tired, hollow. Dad spent his whole life thinking money and power were the only things that mattered. And I spent my whole life trying to live up to that. But in the end, none of it saved me. He shook his head. "You were right. Mom was right. Carter Enterprises is dead." And I was too blind to see it. For the first time since this all started, Ryan sounded like my brother again. I sat down across from him, folding my hands on the table. "So, what happens now?" Ryan let out a breath. "I don't know. I have nothing left." I studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, I reached into my own stack of papers and pulled out an envelope.
He frowned.
"What's that?" I slid it across the table. Mom's final instruction. He hesitated, then picked it up and unfolded the letter inside. I watched his face as he read, watched the way his fingers trembled slightly as he took in Mom's last words. "Despite everything, Ryan is still your brother. He was just as much a victim of your father's world as you were. He simply coped differently. If he ever shows signs of change, offer him the chance to be better." When he finished reading, his hands clenched around the letter. He blinked rapidly, like he was trying to hold something back. I cleared my throat. "Mom left a fund. An environmental education program. It's already set up, but it needs someone to manage it." Ryan looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You're giving it to me?" "I'm offering it to you," I corrected. "It's your choice." For a long time, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he let out a shaky breath. "I don't deserve this." "Maybe not," I said honestly. "But that's the thing about second chances. You have to earn them." Ryan swallowed, looking down at the letter again. After a long moment, he nodded. It wasn't immediate. It wasn't easy. But over the next few months, Ryan changed. He threw himself into the work, learning everything he could about sustainability, conservation, and education. He wasn't perfect, he still had his temper, his sharp edges, but for the first time he was trying. And that was enough. On what would have been Mom's birthday, we stood in her garden. Ryan touched one of the rose bushes, his fingers gentle against the petals. "She tried to get me interested in this stuff when we were kids," he murmured.
Try to teach me about balance.
"I never listened." I smiled. "She never gave up on either of us." Ryan looked at me then, something raw in his expression. "I'm sorry, Olivia." For the first time in our lives, I believed him. I reached out and took his hand. "It's never too late," I said. That night, as I sat in my office, I looked at the two pictures on my desk. One of Mom, kneeling in her garden, teaching me about nature, and one of Ryan, standing in front of a classroom of children, teaching them about marine conservation. Mom had played the long game, not just with money, not just with business, but with us. And in the end, she had won. After the tragic death of my millionaire father, I visited his firm only to have his business partner claim ownership of the $80 million company. He showed me forged documents, ordered the security guards to throw me out, and warned me never to return. Determined to seek revenge, I made my move, and the very next morning, he woke up to a horrific surprise he could never have imagined. "My name is Nancy Carter, and I never imagined that my life would take such a dramatic turn. I was just a regular 23-year-old university student, pursuing a degree in business administration at a prestigious college in Chicago. My dreams were big, like anyone my age, but they were nothing compared to the secure world my father had built for us. My father, Robert Carter, was my hero. He was hardworking, honest, and kind, a man respected by everyone who knew him. He was the co-owner and president of a highly successful firm valued at $80 million, which he had built alongside his business partner, Thomas Green. I used to look up to my father with immense pride. Watching him juggle work and family so effortlessly made me want to follow in his footsteps. But behind that perfect facade lay a betrayal so deep it would shatter everything. It started on a rainy night, the kind of night that makes you want to curl up with a book. I was at home with my mom, Helen Carter, while my dad attended a business dinner with Thomas. He had mentioned the meeting briefly earlier that day, saying they were finalizing some important deals. Dad seemed a little tense, but I didn't think much of it. He always carried the weight of the business on his shoulders. The next morning, I woke up to my mom sobbing uncontrollably. I froze when I heard her say the words, "Your father is gone." My world turned upside down. The doctors said he had suffered a sudden cardiac arrest during dinner. It didn't make sense. Dad was fit, healthy, and full of life. How could this happen so suddenly? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, but at that moment, grief consumed me. We had to arrange the funeral and figure out how to move forward without the man who was the center of our lives. Days turned into weeks, and Mom and I tried to pick up the pieces. It was then that we received a letter from Thomas, inviting us to the firm. He claimed there were important matters to discuss regarding Dad's shares. For the first time since Dad's death, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Thomas was stepping up to help us during this difficult time. We walked into the firm, expecting sympathy, maybe even kindness. Instead, we were met with cold indifference. Thomas sat behind my father's desk, his eyes hard and calculating. He didn't even pretend to soften the blow. "Your father transferred full ownership of the firm to me before he died," he said bluntly, sliding a stack of documents across the desk. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "That's impossible," I shot back. "My father would never do that." Thomas leaned back in his chair, his expression smug. "Well, he did. It's all here in black and white." You can check with any lawyer you want, but I assure you, it's legitimate. I felt my blood boil. My mom tried to reason with him, pleading for him to explain. But Thomas wasn't interested in explanations. He ordered the security guards to escort us out of the building. The humiliation stung almost as much as the betrayal. The man my father had trusted as a partner had turned on us, and now he controlled everything. Outside the building, I held my mother close as she sobbed. My own tears refused to fall. Instead, something inside me snapped. I was angry, not just at Thomas, but at myself for not seeing this coming. How could someone my father trusted so deeply do this to us? More than that, how could he possibly claim my father had willingly handed over the firm? I knew I couldn't let this slide. I owed it to my dad to find out the truth. That night, as I sat alone in my room, I made a silent vow. I would uncover whatever Thomas was hiding, no matter what it took. My first step was hiring someone who could do what I couldn't, a private investigator. I reached out to James Harper, a man known for his tenacity and skill in uncovering hidden truths. When I told him my story, he listened intently, his sharp eyes betraying the wheels turning in his mind. "Nancy," he said after I finished, "if there's foul play involved, I'll find it. But you need to prepare yourself. This won't be easy." I nodded. I'm ready for whatever it takes. The days ahead were daunting. James began digging into Thomas's background, scouring financial records and interviewing people who worked at the firm. Meanwhile, I started brushing up on legal procedures, knowing that I would need a strong case if we uncovered anything. The more I learned about my father's business dealings, the clearer it became that Thomas had been planning this for a long time. I couldn't share much of this with my mom. She was still fragile, struggling to cope with Dad's death. But I felt a growing determination. If there was even a shred of truth in my suspicions, I would bring Thomas down. He thought he could destroy my father's legacy and get away with it. He thought wrong. And so, the first chapter of my fight for justice began. Little did I know this was only the tip of the iceberg. There were secrets buried so deep that even I wasn't prepared for the full truth. But one thing was certain. I would stop at nothing to see my father's name cleared and his betrayer brought to justice. The weeks that followed felt like a whirlwind of emotions, anger, grief, and a relentless drive for justice. After my father's sudden death and Thomas's betrayal, I knew I couldn't let things rest. Every day, I replayed Thomas's smug expression in my mind, and it fueled my determination. My father didn't deserve this. Not the way he died, not the lies, and certainly not the theft of everything he had worked so hard to build. James Harper, the private investigator I had hired, became my lifeline. I'll never forget the first phone call he made after beginning the investigation. "Nancy, I think you were right," James said. His voice was calm, but edged with seriousness. "There's something suspicious here." That one sentence gave me a glimmer of hope. "What did you find?" "Not everything yet," he replied, "but I've dug into some of the firm's financial records. Things don't add up. There are discrepancies, money moving around in strange ways right before your father's death. I also found something interesting about Thomas. Let's just say he's not as clean as he pretends to be." I gripped the phone tightly. "What do you mean?" "Thomas has been in debt for years," James explained. "Gambling mostly. His losses are enormous. He's been using the firm's money to cover it up, but it looks like your father was starting to catch on. I think that's why Thomas made his move when he did." Hearing this sent a chill down my spine. My dad had always been so careful about the business, always transparent and honest. The thought of him realizing his partner was stealing from him, and possibly even confronting him, made my chest tighten. I didn't know how far Thomas's betrayal truly went, but I was beginning to understand the depth of his greed. James wasn't done. "I'm still looking into the night your father died," he said. "There's something strange about the timing and how everything unfolded. I'll need more time to confirm it, but I believe Thomas had a hand in more than just stealing the firm." That statement lingered with me long after we hung up. Could Thomas have been responsible for my father's death? It seemed unthinkable. But then again, so did everything else he had done. Over the next few weeks, James continued to dig deeper. Meanwhile, I began preparing for the legal battle I knew was coming. I reached out to John Reynolds, a lawyer known for taking on difficult cases. When I told him about my situation, he didn't hesitate. "Nancy," he said during our first meeting, "this is going to be a tough fight. Thomas has money, resources, and now control of the firm. But if what you're saying is true, and if we can prove it, we have a chance." I nodded. "I don't care how long it takes. I'm not giving up." Working with John and James gave me a sense of purpose, but it didn't erase the pain of losing my father. Every time I walked past his photograph at home, I felt a pang of guilt. I should have been there for him more. I should have noticed the signs. But then I reminded myself, I was doing this for him. I was fighting to preserve his legacy. The breakthrough came one evening when James called me, his voice more urgent than usual. "Nancy, I found something big." "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I got my hands on surveillance footage from the restaurant where your father had his last meal with Thomas," he said. "It shows Thomas slipping something into your father's drink." I froze, unable to process what I was hearing. "You're sure?"
Yes.
"It's clear as day," James confirmed. "Your father started showing symptoms shortly after that." I've also spoken to the restaurant staff. One of the waiters remembers Thomas being unusually insistent about serving your father himself. The truth hit me like a freight train. Thomas hadn't just stolen the firm. He had murdered my father to do it. I felt a mix of rage and despair, but there was no time to dwell on my emotions. We finally had the evidence we needed to expose him. James didn't stop there. He dug up forged documents Thomas had created to claim ownership of the firm. They were clumsy enough to raise suspicion but convincing enough to fool most people at a glance. Together with the financial discrepancies, the surveillance footage, and testimonies from coerced employees, we had a solid case. With everything in hand, John began building our legal strategy. He filed charges against Thomas for murder, forgery, fraud, and embezzlement. The court issued a warrant for his arrest, but I wanted something more. I wanted Thomas to face the humiliation he had subjected my family to. We planned a dramatic move. On the day of Thomas's arrest, James and I showed up at the firm. I walked through the doors that had once felt like home, now tainted by betrayal. Thomas was sitting at my father's desk, as smug as ever. When he saw me, his expression turned cold. "What are you doing here? I told you never to step foot in this building again." I met his glare with steady eyes. "I'm here to watch justice catch up with you." Before he could respond, the police stormed in. The sight of Thomas being handcuffed in front of the employees, people who had admired my father, was both satisfying and heartbreaking. As they led him away, he shouted protests, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But I knew the truth, and soon everyone else would too. That day marked the beginning of the end for Thomas Green. But for me, it was just the beginning of a long fight to clear my father's name and take back what rightfully belonged to my family. Little did I know, there were still more battles ahead. When Thomas was arrested, I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. It was only the beginning of a legal battle that would test my patience, resilience, and belief in justice. Watching Thomas being led out of the firm in handcuffs gave me some satisfaction, but it didn't erase the damage he had done to my family. There was still so much to fix, and the fight was far from over. The charges against Thomas were serious: murder, forgery, fraud, and embezzlement. But his arrogance didn't waver. From the start, he denied everything, claiming he was being framed. His high-priced legal team painted him as a victim of unfortunate circumstances, someone who had only ever worked in the best interest of the firm. Listening to his lies in the courtroom was infuriating, but I held on to the confidence I had in our evidence and the people supporting me. John Reynolds, my lawyer, was relentless. He presented the evidence James Harper, the investigator, had gathered. The surveillance footage of Thomas slipping something into my father's drink, the financial records showing embezzlement, the forged documents claiming ownership of the firm, and the testimonies from employees who had been coerced by Thomas. It was a mountain of evidence, and every piece told the same story. Thomas Green's greed had driven him to murder my father and steal everything he had built. Still, the trial wasn't easy. Thomas's lawyers did everything they could to discredit our case. They argued that the surveillance footage was unclear, that the financial discrepancies could have been bookkeeping errors, and that the documents were legitimate. They even tried to tarnish my father's reputation, suggesting that he might have had undisclosed debts or made poor business decisions. Those were the hardest moments for me, sitting there and listening to strangers question my father's integrity. It took everything in me not to scream at them. But John was prepared for every tactic they used. He countered their arguments with precision and calm, exposing every lie for what it was. The turning point came when one of the firm's employees, a young accountant named Sarah, decided to testify against Thomas. She had been hesitant at first, scared of retaliation, but she finally found the courage to speak up. "I worked under Mr. Green for 3 years," Sarah said in court, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. "He forced me to alter financial records. He threatened to ruin my career if I didn't comply. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared." When Mr. Carter started asking questions, Thomas became paranoid. He said Mr. Carter was too nosy and that he'd take care of it. Her testimony was a damning blow to Thomas's defense. Combined with the evidence we had already presented, it painted a clear picture of his guilt. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. His confidence wavered, and his lawyers began to stumble in their arguments. The trial dragged on for weeks, but I stayed strong. My mother, Helen, was by my side every step of the way. She didn't always say much, but her presence was a comfort. She reminded me of why I was fighting so hard, to clear my father's name and protect the legacy he had built for us. When the verdict finally came, it felt like the air in the courtroom had turned electric. The judge's voice was firm and unyielding as he read the decision. Thomas Green was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for murder, forgery, and fraud. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but all I could do was sit there, overwhelmed by a mix of emotions. Relief, grief, and vindication washed over me in waves. The judge also ruled that the forged documents were invalid, and ownership of the firm was restored to me and my mother. That moment felt surreal. After everything we had been through, justice had prevailed. My father's name was cleared, and the firm was finally back where it belonged. But even as I walked out of the courtroom that day, I knew my work wasn't done. The firm had been damaged under Thomas's control, and there was a lot to rebuild. Employees were still reeling from the chaos he had caused, and trust needed to be restored. I couldn't let my father's legacy end here. I stood outside the courthouse, looking up at the sky. "We did it, Dad," I whispered. "But there's still more to do. I promise I'll make you proud." And with that promise in my heart, I prepared myself for the next chapter. The battle for justice was over, but the journey to rebuild my father's dream was just beginning. After the courtroom victory, I felt a sense of relief, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of what lay ahead. The firm my father had built, a business worth $80 million, was in shambles after Thomas's mismanagement. Employees were disillusioned, contracts had been mishandled, and the reputation of the company had taken a hit. It wasn't just about reclaiming ownership. I now had the responsibility of rebuilding everything my father had worked so hard to create. The first time I walked into the firm as its rightful owner, it felt bittersweet. The memories of visiting the office as a child with my dad came rushing back, but the energy was different now. The employees who once greeted me with warmth now looked unsure, even wary. I understood their hesitation. Thomas's betrayal had left scars on everyone. I gathered the entire team for a meeting. Standing in the same room where my father had once addressed his employees, I spoke from my heart. "I know the past few months have been incredibly difficult for all of you," I began, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. "My father built this firm with integrity and honesty. He cared deeply about each and every one of you, and he would never have allowed the kind of chaos that Thomas brought here. I'm here to fix what's broken and honor my father's legacy, but I can't do it alone. I need your trust and your support." There was a moment of silence, and then one by one, the employees began to nod. A few even smiled. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few months, I threw myself into rebuilding the company. I leaned heavily on the senior staff members who had worked closely with my father. They were the heart of the firm, and their loyalty and expertise were invaluable. I also reached out to the clients who had distanced themselves during Thomas's reign, assuring them that the firm was under new and trustworthy management. It wasn't easy. There were days when I doubted myself, wondering if I was capable of filling my father's shoes. But every time I felt like giving up, I remembered the promises I had made to my father, to my mother, and to myself. This wasn't just about running a business. It was about preserving a legacy. One day, while going through old files in my father's office, I found a notebook. It was filled with his handwritten plans and ideas for the firm. He had dreams of expanding the company, taking it to new heights, but he had been held back by Thomas's greed and interference. Reading his words filled me with a renewed sense of purpose. I knew what I had to do. I began implementing some of my father's ideas, blending them with the business knowledge I had gained in university. The changes weren't always met with immediate enthusiasm, but slowly, the results began to show. The firm started to regain its footing, winning back contracts and restoring its reputation. The employees, too, began to trust me. They saw how much I cared about the company and how hard I was working to make things right. One day, during a team meeting, one of the older staff members stood up and said, "Your father would be proud of you, Nancy." That simple statement brought tears to my eyes. Amid all this, my mother, Helen, became my biggest supporter. She stepped in to help with administrative tasks, proving that strength runs deep in our family. Watching her resilience inspired me to keep pushing forward. Meanwhile, the fallout from Thomas's arrest continued. His assets were seized, and he faced additional lawsuits from other victims of his schemes. It was clear that his downfall was complete. Occasionally, I wondered if I could ever truly forgive him for what he had done, but the answer always came back as no. Some betrayals are too deep, and the damage he caused to my family would never be forgotten. Months turned into a year, and slowly but surely, the firm began to thrive again. The employees started referring to me as President Carter, a title that initially felt strange, but soon became a source of pride. My father's dreams of expansion, which once seemed impossible, now felt within reach. I could feel his presence in every decision I made, guiding me, encouraging me. One evening, as I was locking up the office, I found myself standing in front of my father's portrait. The weight of everything hit me all at once: the betrayal, the fight for justice, and the long road to rebuilding. I touched the frame and whispered, "We did it, Dad. The firm is ours again, and I promise I'll keep building on what you started." In that moment, I felt a sense of peace. The journey had been long and painful, but it had also made me stronger. I had faced betrayal, fought for justice, and reclaimed my family's legacy. And now, as the leader of the firm, I was ready to honor my father's memory and create a future that he would be proud of. This was more than a victory. It was a new beginning. When I was 19, my jealous parents kicked me out of the house. 16 years later, my father unknowingly funded my greatest achievement. When he heard my name on stage, his face turned pale. He left in anger, but the real shock was still waiting for him. I never imagined I'd see her again. Not after all these years. It was supposed to be my night, a moment of recognition, a celebration of everything I had built for myself. The gala was elegant, filled with industry leaders, researchers, and scholars, all gathered to honor the progress we had made in biomedical research. I had spent years buried in labs, pushing through endless nights of study, sacrifice, and doubt. And now, after all that struggle, I was here, standing in a grand ballroom, waiting to receive an award for my contributions to disease research. But fate had a twisted sense of humor. I had just stepped into the restroom to take a moment for myself, trying to steady my nerves before my name was announced. The air inside was cool, silent except for the faint hum of distant music from the ballroom. I took a deep breath and glanced at my reflection in the mirror. My dark brown hair was pulled into an elegant bun, my navy blue gown falling perfectly against my frame. I looked collected,
Composed.
but inside, my heart was racing. Then I saw her. She stood at the sink, reapplying her lipstick with slow, precise movements. She looked exactly the same, poised, polished, distant. The years hadn't changed her. Eleanor Bennett, my mother. For a second, I thought maybe she wouldn't recognize me. Maybe I could slip away unnoticed. But then, her eyes flicked up to the mirror, landing directly on my reflection. Her hand froze mid-motion, and I saw her jaw tighten. Hannah, that was it. Just my name. No emotion, no warmth, like we had run into each other at some country club instead of facing each other for the first time in 16 years. I didn't expect to see you here, I said, gripping the edge of my clutch. She turned slowly, her posture as rigid as ever. Your father and I were invited. We support organizations that fund medical research. Of course, they had always been involved in charity work, not out of kindness, but because it looked good. The perfect Bennett image had always mattered more than anything. And you, she asked. I'm being honored tonight, I replied, meeting her gaze. For my work in biomedical research. I caught the faintest flicker of surprise in her eyes before she masked it. I see. Well, I suppose everyone finds their way eventually. Her words hit me like a slap. Just like that, I was 19 again, standing in my parents' grand living room, clutching my college acceptance letter, waiting for them to say something, anything. Instead, my father had paced in front of me, voice cold and sharp. This family has standards, Hannah. And you've done nothing but drag us down. I wasn't going to an Ivy League school. I wasn't going to become the perfect daughter they had molded me to be. I had failed them. I could still hear my mother's voice, dripping with irritation when I had tried to explain my struggles in high school. What could you possibly be sad about, Hannah? You have everything. More than most kids your age. You're just making excuses. But I wasn't making excuses. I had been drowning. And they didn't care. When my grades slipped and I only got into a state college, my father exploded. That night, he made it clear if I wanted to waste my life, I would do it on my own. He didn't just cut me off financially. He threw me out. I left that house carrying nothing but a duffel bag, my acceptance letter clutched in my shaking hands. I had no money, no plan, no idea what I was supposed to do next. My mother? She had stayed seated on the couch, scrolling through her phone like I had never even existed. That was the last time I saw either of them. Until now. Standing in that restroom, I could feel the weight of all those years pressing down on me. I wanted to say something. Something to make her understand what it had been like to start over from nothing, to work 2 jobs while going to school, to spend nights crying, because I didn't know if I would make it. But looking at her now, I realized something. She didn't care. She had never cared. Well, she said, adjusting the strap of her designer clutch, enjoy your night, Hannah. And with that, she turned and walked away. I stood there, staring at my reflection in the mirror, feeling a bitter mix of anger, sadness, and something else, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Freedom. I had built the life without them. Without their approval. I didn't need them anymore. Or at least, that's what I thought. I took one last breath, straightened my shoulders, and stepped back into the gala. The evening wasn't over yet.
My name was about to be called.
The award I had fought for, sacrificed for, bled for, was waiting for me. But as I made my way back through the crowd, something caught my eye. At the far end of the ballroom, near the VIP tables, a man sat with his back straight, his face expressionless. He was older now, his dark hair streaked with silver, his suit perfectly tailored. Gregory Bennett. My father. My stomach twisted. If my mother's presence had been a shock, this was something else entirely. He never attended events like this unless he had something to gain. What was he doing here? A sinking feeling crept into my chest, but I pushed it aside. I wouldn't let him ruin this night for me. I was not that lost, desperate 19-year-old anymore. But I had no idea that before the night was over, everything I thought I knew about my father, about myself, was about to be turned upside down. And nothing would ever be the same again. I should have known the night wouldn't end quietly. After my run-in with my mother, I tried to shake off the weight pressing down on my chest. I reminded myself why I was here. This gala wasn't about them. It was about me, about everything I had accomplished on my own. I made my way back to my table, where colleagues and industry leaders were engaged in polite conversation. I smiled, nodding at a few familiar faces, but my mind was elsewhere. My eyes drifted back to the VIP section. Gregory Bennett. My father. I hadn't seen him in 16 years, and yet there he was, sitting among San Diego's wealthiest, his posture as rigid as ever. He wasn't looking at me, didn't acknowledge me, but I felt his presence like a weight pressing against my chest. Why was he here? Before I could dwell on it, the lights dimmed slightly, and a voice rang out over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight. We are honored to celebrate groundbreaking achievements in medical research and education. A warm applause rippled through the crowd as the evening's host, a well-known philanthropist, stepped onto the stage. My heart pounded as I listened, knowing my moment was coming. This year, we are proud to present a very special recognition, the host continued. An award to an individual whose dedication and research have made a profound impact on the future of biomedical advancements. Their perseverance, intelligence, and relentless pursuit of knowledge have changed lives. And tonight, in honor of their incredible work, an anonymous donor has pledged a $1.5 million grant to fund their continued research and educational outreach. A murmur spread through the room. A grant of that size was life-changing. It could fund projects, open doors, change everything. I sat frozen, barely breathing. Then the host smiled. And now I am honored to announce that this year's recipient is Dr. Hannah Bennett. The room erupted in applause. I barely heard it. For a moment, I sat there, stunned. Then I felt hands patting my back, congratulating me, voices murmuring how much I deserved it. I forced myself to move, to stand, to make my way toward the stage. My steps felt slow, almost detached, like I was watching myself from the outside. This was it. This was supposed to be my moment. I reached the podium, took the award in my trembling hands, and turned to face the crowd. But just as I opened my mouth to speak, something caught my eye. My father. He had stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between shock and disgust. And then, before I could process it, he turned and walked out of the room.
Just like that. Right in the middle of my speech.
The claps continued, the audience waiting for me to say something, but my throat felt tight. My eyes lingered on the doors that had just swung shut behind him. I forced a breath. Not now, Hannah. Not tonight. I gripped the podium tighter and began my speech. I thanked my mentors, my colleagues, the organizations that had supported my research. I spoke about the importance of persistence, about fighting for knowledge, about pushing through even when the odds seemed stacked against you. And the whole time, my father's absence sat like a lead weight in my stomach. The moment the ceremony ended, I made my way through the crowd, shaking hands, thanking well-wishers, but my mind was elsewhere. I needed to know why he left. As I reached the back of the ballroom, a conversation stopped me in my tracks. Did you hear? The grant came from Bennett Agritech. I froze. What? That's Gregory Bennett's company, right?
Yes.
It was a last-minute donation, apparently. Completely anonymous, but the foundation confirmed it earlier today. My pulse roared in my ears.
No, it couldn't be.
The $1.5 million grant, my award, had come from my father's company. I staggered back, gripping the nearest chair for balance. Was that why he left? Had he just realized who the recipient was? The irony of it twisted in my gut like a knife. The same man who had kicked me out at 19, who had called me a disgrace, had just unknowingly funded my success. He had given his money away, thinking it would go to some worthy scientist, someone respectable in his eyes. And instead, it had gone to me, the daughter he had disowned. Had he stormed out because he couldn't handle it? I needed to know. Without thinking, I turned and pushed through the doors, out of the ballroom, down the hall. My heels clicked against the marble floors as I scanned the crowd. Then I saw him. He was standing near the exit, speaking to someone on the phone, his face twisted in frustration. For a brief second, I hesitated. Why am I doing this? I had spent years convincing myself that I didn't care what he thought, that I had moved on, that I had built my life without him. But seeing him again, realizing that even after all this time, he still couldn't stand the sight of me, something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, my voice clear, steady. Dad.
He turned.
His grip on the phone tightened, and for a second, I saw something flicker across his face. Shock? Annoyance? Guilt? Hannah, he said flatly. We stood there, face to face, for the first time in 16 years. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, he exhaled sharply. Is there something you need? I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat.
Typical.
He wasn't even going to acknowledge what had just happened. I saw you leave, I said, crossing my arms. Couldn't handle staying in the room when they announced my name. Huh? His jaw clenched. This isn't the time. Oh, really? I stepped closer. You donated that grant, didn't you? Through your company. You had no idea who it was going to. And now that you know, you're, what? Ashamed? His silence was answer enough. I shook my head, feeling something inside me harden. I didn't ask for your money. I didn't ask for anything from you. But it looks like, for once in your life, you actually contributed to something good. And you can't even stand it? His eyes darkened. Watch your tone, Hannah. I scoffed.
Why?
Because I finally have something to say to you? Because I'm not begging for your approvals. His lips curled into something resembling a sneer. You think this changes anything? You're still the same failure I threw out of my house. I felt the words more than I heard them. But the strangest thing happened. They didn't hurt. Not like before. Because for the first time in my life, I realized the truth. His words didn't matter anymore. I had built my own life. My own legacy. Without him. I looked him in the eye, my voice unwavering. You don't get to define me anymore. Then I turned and walked away. And, this time, I was the one leaving him behind. I walked away from my father that night, but the weight of our conversation lingered. His words, sharp and bitter, should have cut me deep, but they didn't. Not in the way they used to. For the first time in my life, I realized that Gregory Bennett's approval meant nothing to me anymore. I had spent years chasing something that was never going to come, waiting for a moment where he would acknowledge my success, where he would say, I was wrong about you, Hannah. But that moment would never come. And I was finally okay with that. The evening at the gala continued in a blur. Congratulations poured in from colleagues and guests, but I could barely register them. My mind was spinning. What was I going to do with the grant? The money, his money, felt like a chain tied to my past, dragging me back into the world I had fought so hard to escape. I barely slept that night. I kept replaying the evening over and over in my head. The moment I saw my mother, the shock on my father's face when he realized who had received the grant, the way he stormed out of the room, unable to even be in the same space as me. By morning, I knew what I had to do. The next day, I sat at my desk, staring at the grant acceptance letter. The amount $1.5 million was enough to fund research, to push my projects forward in ways I had only dreamed of. But it wasn't mine. Not really. No matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, it came from him, from the company that once symbolized everything I had been rejected for. I wasn't going to keep it. Instead, I was going to use it for something that actually mattered. Something that wasn't about proving anything to my father, but about giving back in ways he never would. By noon, I had made my decision. I would donate the entire grant to fund scholarships for underprivileged students like me, who had been told they weren't good enough, who had been cast aside by people who were supposed to support them. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the right decision. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer. I want to reallocate the grant, I told him. I don't want a cent of it for myself. I want it to go towards scholarships for students in STEM fields, kids who never got a fair shot. There was a brief silence. Are you sure, Dr. Bennett? He asked. This could fund your research for years. I exhaled slowly. I'm sure. And just like that, it was done. Later that afternoon, I sat in my office, staring out at the San Diego skyline. For years, I had believed that success was the answer. That if I worked hard enough, if I built a name for myself, if I achieved enough, then maybe, just maybe, I would feel whole. But it wasn't success that had given me closure. It was letting go. Letting go of the need for validation. Letting go of the idea that my parents' approval would somehow change anything about who I was. Letting go of the pain that had anchored me to them for so long. That evening, as I left the university and stepped out into the cool California air, my phone buzzed. A call from Aunt Vivian. She was the only one in my family who had ever supported me. The only one who had called on my birthdays, who had sent me letters while I was struggling through school, who had never made me feel like a disappointment. I answered. "Hey, Aunt Viv. I heard about what you did, Hannah." Her voice was soft, filled with something that sounded like pride. The donation. The scholarships. I smiled faintly. Yeah. It felt like the right thing to do. She paused for a moment. "I hope you know how proud I am of you. Not just for this, for all of it." Something inside me cracked. Maybe it wasn't the validation I had spent years craving, but this quiet, genuine acknowledgement from someone who actually cared meant more than anything my parents could have ever given me. "Thank you," I whispered. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. But I should have known it wasn't over yet. Because the next morning, I got a message from an unknown number. One sentence.
"We need to talk."
And I knew exactly who it was. I stared at the message on my phone. "We need to talk." No name. No context. But I knew exactly who it was. I should have ignored it. After all, what was left to say? I had made my decision. I had walked away. But something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe a lingering ghost of my past, made me reply. "Where?" The response came almost immediately. "My office. 1 hour." I took a deep breath, gripping my phone tightly. My father never asked for meetings.
He commanded them.
He had spent his whole life expecting people to fall in line. And for years I had. Not anymore. An hour later, I stepped into the towering glass building that housed Bennett Agritech. The receptionist didn't need to ask who I was. She simply motioned toward the elevator. I rode it up in silence, my heart steady, my mind clear. When the door slid open, I found myself in a sleek, intimidating office. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown San Diego. And behind a massive mahogany desk, Gregory Bennett sat, staring at me like I was an inconvenience he hadn't quite figured out how to eliminate.
"Hannah," he said.
I didn't sit. "Why am I here?" He exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "I assume you already know the reason. If this is about the grant, I donated it," I said flatly. "It's funding scholarships for students who actually need it." Something flickered in his expression, anger, maybe, or disbelief. "You gave it all away?" "Yes." He leaned back, his jaw tightening. "That money could have funded your research. You could have used it to build something bigger." I tilted my head. "And that's what bothers you, isn't it? Not that I got the grant, but that I refused to keep your money?" Silence. For the first time, I saw something unfamiliar in his face. He had always been a man in control of his business, of his family, of every aspect of his perfectly curated life. But right now, he looked like a man who had just lost something. "You're still as stubborn as ever," he muttered. "I learned from the best," I shot back. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "I didn't know the grant would go to you. I didn't plan for this." "Of course you didn't," I said. "Because in your world, I don't exist." His gaze snapped back to mine. "That's not." He stopped himself, pressing his lips together. I folded my arms.
"Tell me, Dad."
"When they announced my name, when you realized your company had funded my success, what did that feel like?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, walking to the window, staring down at the city below. Finally, he spoke. "You remind me too much of her." I frowned.
"Who?"
"Vivian." I blinked. "Aunt Vivian?" He nodded. She was always reckless, always refusing to follow the rules, making life harder for herself. He let out a bitter chuckle. "My father hated her for it, and I never understood her either. Until you." I swallowed hard. "So that's it?" You threw me out because I wouldn't become the version of me you wanted. His silence was answer enough. I shook my head, letting out a small, humorless laugh. You never cared, did you? About my struggles, about what I went through after you kicked me out. You just cut me off like I was a mistake. He turned to face me then, and for the first time, I saw regret. Faint, buried deep, but real. I thought I was doing what was necessary, he admitted. You were weak, Hannah. You were falling apart, and I didn't know how to fix you. So I pushed you. I thought if I cut you off, you'd. He exhaled sharply. I thought it would make you stronger. I stared at him, stunned. You thought abandoning me would make me stronger? I whispered. That's not parenting, Dad. That's cruelty. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself. I shook my head. You don't get to take credit for the person I became.
You didn't build me.
You broke me. And I put myself back together. A long silence stretched between us. Then he spoke again, his voice quieter. And yet here you are, in my office. Speaking to me, I met his gaze, and for the first time in my life, I felt nothing but pity. Not because I need you, I said, but because I wanted to see if you had changed. I stepped back toward the door. But you haven't. He exhaled, rubbing his forehead. Hannah. No, I cut him off. There's nothing left to say. I turned and walked out. And this time, I knew I would never look back. A week later, I stood on the stage of San Diego University, addressing a room full of students. Students who, like me, had once been told they weren't good enough. Resilience isn't about proving people wrong, I said, looking across the crowd. It's about proving yourself right. The applause was thunderous. But the real victory wasn't in the sound. It was in the knowledge that I had finally let go. I had built my own path, and it was mine alone.